topic for Topics Tuesday is going to be North Korea. This is part 3 of our Tuesday deep dives into it. And we today are going to start with a very, very sad topic. Here is the resource document. Remember, you can all follow along. I believe I've got the shortcut for it in chat. Here. This is a document we are learning from today. And we are starting with this section here. The United States brutally repressed the people in South Korea, including backing the genocide of Jeju Island because they were politically too left-wing and did not approve of our presence, the U.S. government's presence. I'm an American, remember. And this is the history of the United States involvement in Korea. So this is the period of time at the end of World War II, but before the Korean War. So for anybody who's, maybe this is your first time joining in, it's totally fine. You don't have to have caught the previous episodes yet or the previous streams yet. I'll give you just a mini recap, which is that at the end of World War II, Korea, which had been up until the end of World War II, a colony of Japan, was released from Japanese colonial control. And they formed their own government, their indigenous government on the peninsula, and it was communist. And the United States did not like this, so they occupied the southern half of Korea and imposed a military dictatorship there in the south and attempted to murder all of the communists and stop the left-wing communist movement. So we think of the northern half of Korea as being communist and the southern half as being capitalist. That was designed and created by the USA. Originally, all of Korea was communist. So the United States had to get to work along with a proxy puppet government we set up there under a man named Syngman Rhee, who was of Korean national origin, but who had spent most of his life in the United States and got a degree from Princeton, I believe. The United States government brought Syngman Rhee to South Korea to put him in charge of Korea, and he was more anti-communist in many ways even than most Americans were. He was friends with the McCarthy-era Republicans in Congress, and he was like, we have to kill all the communists here. So this is the era, this is what was going on politically in the southern half of Korea when the Jeju massacre happened. Now, the first text we have here is actually a book. We're not going to be able to read the book, right? So this is a recommendation that I'm going to have for you. It is The Island of World Peace by Gui Kwon, and it is quite good. We can read a little preview of the book to get you started on it. But, you know, that is going to be additional reading, and we'll actually read these other texts. So I do recommend that you guys check out Gui Kwon's book. Gui Kwon is a researcher at the Tamla Cultural Institute in Jeju National University. So this is an example of her book. She's got a lot of images in here, and one of the unique things about this genocide is that it was kept secretive. It was kept hidden for many, many years, and it wasn't until the late 90s, I believe, that people started to unearth it. So a lot of the research and work being done on it today, the people who are uncovering it and putting together the history of this, they are still alive and working. They are currently working on discovering even more. Hi, Zaki, welcome. So, yes, so they're talking about structures that were built here. She's talking about this on Jeju. In Hamdeok village in northern Jeju, castle-like walls 2.5 meters wide were built around the village, with 4 main gates around the village and a number of small gates in between the main ones. A guard posted at the front of the gate was built on elevated ground. In Nakseon in Seonhul village in northern Jeju, a square-shaped wall is 3 meters high and 1 meter wide was built around the village, and a trench 2 meters deep was dug around the wall, and thorns were placed inside of it. The total length of the wall was about 500 meters. Now, why are these being built? Well, Jeju Island was an actual island. It still is an island off of the coast of the southern part of Korea. And they had been considered a hotbed of the political organizing work. They had really been fighting back against the American occupation of their land. And they had guerrilla fighters there who were like, these people need to leave our country. So this small island was heavily engaged in trying to fight off the American occupation. And the American occupation was not legal. It was there illegally. It should not have been there. Researchers, yes, as Kalti Moose is saying, yes, researchers were not even sure they could initially report on this because of the National Security Act in South Korea, which makes it illegal to say anything negative about their government or illegal to say anything positive about the North. And they were not sure if even as they were uncovering this, they would be able to to talk about it. So this is the kind of details that are happening in Guisaguan's book. I do recommend that everybody check out her book for additional reading. This is the unnamed monument, right? Mass killings, she says here, were principally carried out by counterinsurgency forces. But there were some insurgents also. Remember, they were fighting for their lives. Visceral acts of killing and physical violence are only part of the story. More than 40,000 Jeju people fled to Japan to escape the killings. By the end of the massacre, 91,732 people, almost half of those who had remained on Jeju, had become refugees, with 39,285 homes being completely destroyed. And you'll see many people call it a massacre. Now, most academics are classifying it as a genocide, but this was a little bit earlier in the understanding of it. And when I say earlier, this was maybe 2018 or something like that. So this is a very recently developing understanding of what occurred there. Some 134 dong, which was a subdivision of a village, were completely wiped off the map of Jeju as houses of the displaced residents were burned down and the survivors were scattered. If humans were displaced, so was the history of the atrocity. For most of its post-war period, the Jeju massacre was kept hidden from the public through anti-communist propaganda that legitimated the suppression of communists on the basis of both the 1948 National Security Law and anti-communism laws of 1961, which allowed the state to punish people who opposed its anti-communist policies. However, after decades of silence, an advocacy movement on behalf of Jeju victims began in 1980s during a broader movement for democratization and civil and political rights in South Korea. Jeju residents fought for restorative justice by advancing a counter-narrative to the state's official history of Jeju 4-3. It's April 3rd. That's a significant date when the massacre started. One that focused on recognition of the victims' suffering. Their efforts resulted in a special act for investigation of Jeju 4-3 and restoration of the honor of victims in 2000. The year 2000, right? That's how recently they were figuring this out. And the reason this was uncovered is because they started to build an airport there and they uncovered mass graves. And they had to trick locals who were old enough into talking about their memories of it. Because locals remembered and they were like, we don't talk about it because we'll be taken off to war, right? And the reason why it's starting to get classified more and more as a genocide is because these were American-backed killings done at the behest of the American government's occupation of the land. So since everybody in Korea was a communist, they could not say these were politically motivated killings. They had to basically say they were killing them for being Korean at that point. Because so much of the Korean identity just was to be opposed to this invasion and occupation. So this is where kind of the, is it a genocide, is it not, was going. And now most people are like, this is a genocide. So, as a consequence, the official report in 2003 by the Jeju 4-3 National Committee for the Investigation of the Truth, and this is the year I graduated high school, that's how recent this understanding is, established by the Kim Dae-jung government, replaced the public narrative of a communist rebellion with one highlighting civilian sacrifices. Moreover, President Roh Moo-hyun officially apologized for state violence as president of South Korea on the basis of the official report in that year. In 2005, he declared Jeju an island of world peace to sublimate the tragedy of Jeju 4-3 into reconciliation and coexistence and eventually contribute to world peace. Finally, in 2008, the Jeju 4-3 Peace Park was created to commemorate those who died or disappeared as a consequence of the massacre. It has since become an important site for the collective memory of the massacre and is visited by South Koreans and people from other countries. So the book here examines the history of Jeju 4-3, its aftermath from the outbreak of violence to the construction of the Peace Park through the lens of the state-building process of South Korea. The concept of the state is contentious, but here I use sociologist and historian Charles Tilley's definition: relatively centralized, differentiated organizations, the officials of which more or less successfully claim control over the chief concentrated means of violence within a population inhabiting a large contiguous territory. As Tilley's definition makes clear, violence is central to the state-building process, a key insight for understanding South Korean history and the Jeju 4-3 incident's place on it. While South Korea is now recognized as a wealthy democratic nation-state that is renowned for its popular culture, it has experienced a complex and often traumatic process of state-building from its inception. The history of Jeju 4-3 and its aftermath is an illustration of the state-building process of South Korea. Jeju's people experienced violent state formation, their incorporation into the anti-communist state in the post-4-3 period, and the establishment of state-led truth commissions about Jeju 4-3 with the arrival of democracy. So you can read a lot of this here. Not all of it, right? We'll read a little bit more, but then we'll start with an entire article from start to finish. The concept of the state building is contentious, but the study defines it as a long-term internal process of forming a legitimate, stable, and sustainable state that involves national security, national identity, economic development, and political democracy. Now, you also often hear people say that the state has a monopoly on violence. This is actually a compatible view with a Marxist-Leninist understanding of the state. When we hear Marx and Engels talk about the state, we think of it as the means through which one class of people oppresses another, right? So at this time, what was going on in South Korea, hi, welcome, Gabby, was that we had the Americans, the owning class, the bourgeoisie of the United States, right, who had agents operating in Korea who were seeking to crush the communist uprising there. So the people on the peninsula were all poor people. They were all very working class. There was only a handful of people who had any sort of money. There was like very, very few of them, and it's because they had collaborated with the Japanese before. So this was the state being wielded, the state power by Syngman Rhee, sure, but Syngman Rhee had been put in place by the United States government and had the full backing of General MacArthur and all of the Republicans in Congress back home in the United States during the McCarthyism era. So this was the United States state apparatus as well, backing this new developing South Korean country. The people in Korea did not want South Korea and North Korea to be their own countries. They wanted their one country, right? So to build a state, they really, the American bourgeoisie, the Republicans in Congress, the McCarthy-era politicians in the USA, General MacArthur, Syngman Rhee, they had to use violence to forcefully build a state against the wishes of the people there. So when we talk about this massacre being the result of state building, that's what we mean, right? The owning class, right, of the United States had to forcefully use a state apparatus to build a country where the people there, the working class, did not want there to be a new country, and the way that this was done was by executing people who fought back. Bye, Virgo. Scholars who have studied state building in South Korea argue that the national division and the establishment of two separate governments on the Korean Peninsula during the early Cold War had a profound influence on setting key goals of state building in South Korea. And now remember, the division of the Korean Peninsula was supposed to be temporary. The United States was like, after the end of World War II, we're going to divide the peninsula temporarily, and then in like 5 years, they'll be able to be their own country again. This never happened. And the United States never really intended for this to happen. The United States was like, we're going to be in charge of them for at least 40 years minimum. But, this is what they thought. So they did not think they were going to be having two separate countries. They did not want two countries. The people of Korea never wanted to be divided in the first place. So that's why the division had such an influence on South Korea. After the state makers formed a government amid violent suppression against political leftists and dissenters, they sought for legitimacy, national security, national identity, and financial stability. The Korean War was a watershed of state building in terms of national security, legitimacy, and national identity. In post-war South Korea, the Rhee Syngman and Park Chung-hee regimes give an impetus to economic development and capitalist modernization while encouraging voluntary participation of people, particularly women. A long-term struggle for democracy on the basis of economic growth and the expansion of the liberal middle class helped to reach democratic governance by the end of the 1980s. Now, we talked about this in our podcast episode, if you've been following along with the podcast as well, for an extra deep dive, right? But basically what happened is the United States showed up in Korea and said, we want to create a liberal Western democracy here, right? But the problem is that a liberal Western democracy only works if you have people that capitalists would refer to as a middle class, right? We as Marxists, we're like, there's two classes, the working and the owning class. But the middle class is it's thought of people who can enjoy a comfortable existence under capitalism, who are not super heavily exploited to the fact that they might be driven to join a vanguard party and rise up against them, right? People who benefit, people who feel they benefit anyway from capitalism without actually being members of the bourgeoisie themselves. But the problem is that when they got to Korea, none of that happened. Nothing was there. Everybody in Korea had been colonial imperial victims, subjects of Japan. They were extremely poor. They were numerous. There were so many, most of them, right, were that. And there was a handful of, when I always make the joke about 12 rich guys control everything, in Korea it was like 12 rich guys, and that was it, literally, who had only been able to have a comfortable existence because they had collaborated so aggressively with the Japanese. And the Korean people hated them. They hated them. So there was no middle class there. To support this idea of a liberal democracy being set up by the United States in favor of capitalism. The people there knew they were heavily exploited, and they knew this would not benefit them. And that's in part why they fought back so much. They were communists for a reason. So when they say the expansion of the liberal middle class helped reach democratic governance, we think about democracy, we think about lowercase d, democracy, little d, which basically, sorry, just want to make sure nothing bad's happening. My phone's going off. Okay, no, it's okay. My partner is just texting me cute things, sorry. But a lot of them, so I'm worried, sorry. So a lowercase d democracy, right? Oh, that's something that's achievable in communism. Communism is some of the most direct democracy on the planet. So when we talk about democracy in this sense, what do we mean? We mean capitalist democracy. We mean capitalism. That's what they really mean. So in order to have this liberal democracy, in order to have capitalism, you need a middle class. So the fact that they were expanding the middle class by the end of the 1980s is significant to the art of state building there and how it goes. Right? They needed that. They needed a middle class in order to significantly bolster up and maintain the capitalist government they were trying to put in place. Welcome to First Time Chat. Oven Baked Twink. Great username. So following the end of military rule, South Korean regimes have moved on to democratic consolidation, a more advanced stage of state building. Jeju-43 and its aftermath both shaped and was shaped by these processes. The emphasis on state building over the longue durée builds on an already rich historiography of the Jeju-43 events while also addressing critical lacunas in the existing literature. The majority of previous studies of the history of Jeju-43 focus on the causes and the historical background of the uprising and counterinsurgency campaign. With the release of U.S. military and government documents in the 1980s, academic work on Jeju-43 emerged. John Merrill, the author of the Jeju-do Rebellion, addressed the local, national, and international context of the uprising and counterinsurgency operations. Bruce Cummings, author of The Origins of the Korean War, regarded Jeju-43 as a precursor to the Korean War, noting how a strong political leadership on Jeju and the U.S. military government in South Korea worked to produce the conflict. Recently, Jeju-43 studies in North America have re-examined the background of the uprising and counterinsurgency operations. Military historians such as Kang Go-son remarked on the role of local communists and the left-leaning South Korean Labor Party in the course of Jeju-43. Meanwhile, Soo Kyung-hwang examined how a power struggle among local communist rebels, civilians, the U.S. military, and the South Korean government created violence on Jeju, while Brendan Wright focused on the relationship between state violence and the formation of the South Korean state within the broader context of politicidal violence. Now, I want to take a second to point something out here. I talk about this a lot, but, in case it's your first time here. In the TV show Squid Game, right, there's a scene where the people of South Korea find out somebody next to them is from the North. And they ask, was it better up there? Because the whole point of Squid Game, right, is they're suffering so much under capitalism. And the person from the North doesn't say anything. Now, for those of us not living in South Korea, okay, they didn't say anything. I don't know, whatever. They're like, maybe, I don't know. What does that mean, right? Bigger plump smiles. Your boss at work in South Korea, his parents were loaded. They might have collaborated with the Japanese, or they could have come into wealth more in the 80s. What does that mean? Why did the person from North Korea say nothing? Well, it's because in South Korea, it's illegal to say anything positive about the North. They have to deal with the National Security Act. Now remember, even reporting that this happened, they thought would violate the National Security Act. So they cannot be too favorable to the communists. Lee Suk-won lives in South Korea still. And anybody who is South Korean, when you travel around the world, you're still not allowed to break the laws of South Korea. They have some of the harshest, what they call extraterritorial, I believe, enforcement of laws in South Korea. So anywhere you travel, you have to adhere to South Korean laws, including the National Security Act, including not saying anything positive about the North. So when they write, they have to be very, very, very careful with how they talk about this, right? So anytime you read text written by somebody from South Korea, the ROK, even if it's academic text, remember, they have to be extremely careful to ride this line and not be too nice and sympathetic to the communists, or they could get locked up in prison. So when you read this, keep this in mind, right? South Korean scholars have also played an instrumental role in furthering our understanding of the 4-3 violence. After the movement for democratization in the late 1980s in South Korea, South Korean scholars explored alternative interpretations to the official history of communist rebellion. For example, scholars such as Ko Chang-hoon emphasized the Jeju people's resistance against the suppression of the U.S. military government and the division of the country, while others, such as Heo Ho-jun, interpreted the counterinsurgency operations as a political genocide. In response, Ko Mun-jeong and other conservative scholars have stressed the responsibility of communist rebels for the massacre. See how she has to lay them all out? Like, this is just what other people think, right? It's like that. Recently, studies throughout the globe have addressed the truth-seeking and reconciliation processes connected to 4/3. Kim Jong-min explored the role of local journalism, academic circles, and the development of democracy in the truth-seeking process. Han Joon Kim, who wrote the only monograph about Jeju 4/3 in English, chronicled the persistent local activism that laid the foundation for the Truth Commission process. Meanwhile, the Hyunik Kwan and Myung-lim Park explored the role of local initiatives and the moral and political solidarity of Jeju people in achieving reconciliation. Despite this often exemplary work, these studies have largely overlooked three crucial points. First, they did not fully describe how and why the newborn state adopted strong repression measures or reintegration policies at different points throughout the 6.5 years of the incident. From this vantage point, it's important to note these armed conflicts took place over the critical period of state formation in South Korea. Though some scholars, such as Heo and Wright, addressed the relationship between the mass killings by the regime and the birth of South Korea, they did not clearly discuss histories following 1948 to 1949's mass killings, including the mobilization of islanders during the Korean War. In these works, the analysis of state building is limited to phenomena of mass violence rather than the total 4/3 process. Second, and related to this, studies have largely ignored the post-4/3 history during the authoritarian years. The massacre ended on September 21, 1954, when the authorities ordered the reopening of Mount Hala on Jeju Island and displaced residents returned to their villages. However, the truth-seeking process started in the end of the 1980s. Previous works have largely overlooked these intervening years, which are crucial to understanding the state-building process. So, this is what her book kind of focuses on. Again, we don't have the full book. We wouldn't have time to read the whole thing anyway, right? Multiple pages are skipped in this, so we can't read it here, but I just wanted to give you a little overview of her work and what it's about. And it is important and good work, and I really recommend that you all check out this book. So this book is what is here, recommended at the top of this. Now, to start, we're actually going to look at a website that documents what they found about the massacre, about the genocide. And this is the Jeju43peace.org website. So we're going to start. This is their website that the researchers use, and they update with info to get to the public. It's public facing. It's written in popular speak. It's less academic. From truth to peace, to just kind of talk about what's happened. So the material from this section, they say, is taken from the What is the Jeju April 3rd Uprising and Massacre booklet published by the Memorial Committee for the 70th anniversary of the Jeju 4/3 Uprising and Massacre. This booklet was published in English and Korean to mark the 70th anniversary of the tragedy in 2018 in partnership with the Jeju 4/3 Peace Foundation, the Jeju 4/3 Archives, the Association for 4/3 Victims and Bereaved Families, and the Jeju 4/3 Research Institute, and others. The publication aims to provide an accessible resource on the key findings of the National Committee for Investigation of the Truth about the Jeju 4/3 events. The Truth Commission was established in 2000 and continues to carry out research into what happened on the island between 1947 and 1954, making it the longest-running Truth Commission in the world. So this is 6 years that this occurred over, right? And since the year 2000, they're still trying to uncover it. The material in this chapter draws from what can be found in the much more extensive Jeju 4/3 investigation report published in 2003. So minor edits they made for translation issues, etc. The final text reproduced here was reviewed by the Memorial Committee for the 70th anniversary of the uprising and massacre before publication. So each of these you can click. The website's very, very cute. So here's the background. And this is quite long. We probably won't be able to read through all of it on stream, but we'll see how much we can get through today. Jeju Island is a beautiful volcanic island located off the southern coast of Korea. Thanks to its beautiful beaches and volcanic landscapes, it's not only a popular holiday destination in Korea, but the whole of Asia. However, few visitors are aware that 70 years ago the island was covered in blood in what is known as the Jeju 4/3 Uprising and Massacre. Also known as the Jeju 4/3 incident, it is known colloquially as Sasam in Korean, which indicates the date of April 3rd, 1948, when armed leftists attacked police stations on the island. Now think about this. This is from South Korea that they're publishing this in English, right? So you're going to notice the difference in how it's reported by different people around the world, and you have to keep the National Security Act in mind. This is the official way that South Korean government talked about this. They were like, armed leftists attacked police stations. Nobody mentions why. What were the police stations? Who were the police? What was happening? Why were there so many leftists there? Nobody mentions the fact that the leftists were the island. it was Korea. Korea was the leftists. All of Korea was the leftists. The American military, if you followed last week when we did our stream, they were writing back and saying this whole place is communist. Everybody here is communist, right? So the leftists and the Korean people were synonymous. So what really happened is the Korean people attacked police stations that were being used by an occupying force of the U.S. military that had been massacring them already to try to drive out the American occupation on their land, right? So you have to keep this stuff in mind when you learn about this, right? It is illegal for them to be too favorable to any of the leftists or the communists and speak too harshly about their government's role in this, because their government that South Korea has today is born from the same government. This is the same government, and when Gui Kwan says they were state building, that's the continuity you need to understand. The current government of the ROK today is born from this. This is the state they built. That's what she's referencing, right? So there was a chaotic period immediately following independence from Japan as the Korean Peninsula entered the Cold War era. And now, if you remember what we talked about last week, you're like, oh, what an interesting way to position this, right? Some individuals, including the first president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, in addition to the U.S. government, wanted to establish a separate government in the southern half of Korea. Others opposed national division and wanted to establish a unified country with a Soviet-occupied northern half. Now think about this too. We know that the northern half is not actually occupied by the Soviet Union. We know that it's a lie made up by the West. We also know that everyone opposed national division except for the U.S. government and Syngman Rhee, who had been living in the United States before he was brought over to South Korea by the U.S. government to be the puppet leader. So really, Syngman Rhee is the U.S. government for all intents and purposes here. He also had been working with the OSS, which we know from last week, right? So think about this. Others oppose the national division. This is the kind of way that the law in the ROK in the southern half of Korea shapes how you're allowed to talk about history. Everyone opposed national division and wanted to establish a unified Korea with the rest of their country, which was not occupied by the Soviets. Jeju Islanders courageously resisted the division of the Korean Peninsula and strongly protested the first election that was scheduled for May 10th, 1948, that would confirm the formation of the ROK south of the 38th parallel. That part is true. The military and police ruthlessly cracked down on Jeju Islanders in response to the protests. Approximately 30,000 people, or 1 in every 10 residents at the time, lost their lives during this period. In order to understand the historical context, the following chapter draws from what is the Jeju April 3rd Uprising and Massacre booklet. So we'll go there next. On August 15th, 1945, Korea regained its independence, ending 35 years of Japanese colonial rule over the peninsula. It was a happy day for most Koreans, as liberation meant the end of conscription and forced labor, in addition to increased freedom to use Korean names. On the other hand, for those who had colluded with Japan, independence was a worrisome time amid calls for collaborators to be brought to justice. The conflict in how the public viewed the period after independence was both the cause and number of tragic events. Now remember, there was actually no conflict in how the public viewed the period. There was a handful of very rich people, and everybody else was like, they are traitors and they should be brought to justice. Both the Daegu Autumn Uprising and Jeju 4-3 Massacre happened within 3 years, and the Korean War followed 2 years after independence. There are many reasons for the tragic events that followed independence, including conflict between left-wing and right-wing forces that was compounded by geopolitical competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the region. Now, we know the left-wing forces were the Korean people, the right-wing forces were the United States government. That was it. Those were the right-wing forces. And the geopolitical competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the region, well, the U.S. certainly saw it that way, but the Soviet Union didn't really. They had other things going on. They didn't really care. However, arguably the most crucial reason for the conflict is that Koreans relied on external powers rather than being able to achieve independence without assistance. Now think about how this is wording. The Koreans relied on external powers. Absolutely not. Koreans were committing suicide en masse. They were guerrilla fighters in the thousands in the streets. They did not rely on external powers. They did not ask anybody to save them from the Americans. They took up arms and tried to fight off the Americans themselves. So this is also very interesting language. They're blaming themselves. They're doing a little victim blaming on this website, right? So just remember, you have to be critical of that National Security Act when you read through these things. It's very fascinating. So as is well known, Japan was defeated by the Allies during the Pacific War, and it lost control of the Korean Peninsula. And it was through this process that Korea became independent, which means that the people did not secure independence from Japan without the help of foreign powers. Kind of. Technically. But also, That's not the way I would word that, certainly. The Allies' fight against Japan was not driven by sympathy for the plight of Koreans under Japanese rule, but for geopolitical control of the Asia-Pacific region. True. Following liberation, the strategic importance of the peninsula meant that the great powers divided it among themselves, with the Soviet Union occupying the north and the U.S. occupying the south. Now remember, you guys probably remember this. If you haven't, the podcast talks about this. But the USSR did not want to occupy Korea. They the whole time were like, hey, the Korean people probably want to be independent. I don't think we should do this. Their only involvement was because the Americans wanted the occupation to last 40 years. They were like, that's fucking ridiculous. Absolutely not. What are you doing to these people? They managed to talk them down to 5, right? And get them to just occupy part of the peninsula. But that wasn't even, the 30th parallel wasn't even intended to be a dividing line. It was literally just to clear out the Japanese military that remained at the end of World War II to clear up their surrender. And that was it. So this, again, is playing into that kind of Western narrative. We have to be really mindful about it, right? Although this has drawn comparisons of the division of Germany in the wake of the defeat of World War II, the division of Korea did not follow defeat in war, but liberation from Japanese colonial rule. The U.S. occupation of the southern half of Korea was announced by Proclamation No. 1 by General of the Army Douglas MacArthur on September 7th, 1945. So this is a decision made by the United States military. The peninsula was, of course, the land of the Koreans. As such, Koreans were not willing to allow the U.S. or the Soviet Union to rule over the land. The Soviet Union didn't really try. And people mobilized to establish a Korea without external influence. Liu Wu-hyung was one such individual. As the defeat of Japan approached, Liu joined others to establish the Alliance for the National Government. Later, the Alliance for National Government became the Committee for the Preparation for Korean Independence, and the committee took temporary charge over security matters. They were made a nationwide organization established by Koreans to create a new state following the end of Japanese rule. Being a genuine grassroots movement for democracy, it changed its names to the People's Committees. So if you guys were here last week or the week before, you remember all about the People Committee. Yeah, as Malrich says, Ireland probably doesn't win its independence if England isn't occupied with world wars. Ireland does not owe its independence to the Nazis, though. Exactly. It's a weird way that they're framing it, right? The U.S. MGIK declared itself, though, the only legitimate power south of the 38th parallel and did not recognize the new state declared by the People's Committees. Now, what happened in the North? The USSR was like, cool, the People's Committees are the government now. Bye. So when we say North Korea is the decolonial, indigenous government of Korea, it is. They were the half of the country where the People's Committees that were established everywhere were actually allowed to thrive free of interference. In the South, the U.S. military government in Korea, the USAMJIK, crushed the People's Committees. In the North, the People's Committees became the government, and that is still the government they have to this day. As the People's Committees enjoyed widespread popular support and was established throughout the country, the USAMJIK forcefully dissolved the committee so that it could effectively rule the country. It was, however, the USMGIK policy of rehiring officers from the Japanese colonial era that most antagonized Koreans. They tried to justify this policy by the need to implement effective governance, but the failure to prosecute officers who had collaborated with the Japanese increased public resentment. After liberation, the movement to establish a new country was also active in Jeju. Although the People's Committees in other regions were either dissolved by the U.S. military government of Korea or operated under different names, the Jeju People's Committee remained intact and enjoyed strong support. And they don't mention this, of course, but the People's Committees were basically communist. There were some left-wing nationalists in there, but it was mostly communist. And the reason it was mostly communist, if you guys remember from previous stream, was that they released all the political prisoners at the end of World War II from the prisons, and all the political prisoners had been communists, and they went out and started organizing the People's Committees. So this was largely because the pro-Japanese faction was relatively weak in Jeju, and many people who had fought for independence against the Japanese returned to their hometowns and became members of the People's Committee in Jeju. Now, who were those people? They were the communists who had fought against the Japanese. Kim Il-sung included, right? Kim Il-sung was one of the communists who fought against the Japanese. So the people, so they can't say that here because it's South Koreans saying it. They're not allowed to say that. So think about the difference between how Americans are free to write about what happened and how South Koreans are forced to write about it. They can't tell you the stuff that we learned in last week from American scholars or scholars in different places around the world. There was also more social cohesion in Jeju, where 80% of farmers were independent landholders, in contrast to the national average of 40%. Furthermore, Jeju also had a strong community spirit that fed into the People's Committees as an autonomous organization. Most importantly, the People's Committees invested heavily in education and actively helped to establish schools on the island. The People's Committee in Jeju demonstrated leadership in the period following independence. The U.S. military government in Korea sorry, I have that on, ruled the country in a larger sense, but the People's Committee had more direct influence on Jeju on people's lives. Therefore, the U.S. military government in Korea considered the Jeju People's Committee an important partner and sent the organization official documents as it did to other public offices. Eli Grant Mead, I believe is his name, a U.S. MGIK officer, said the Jeju People's Committee was the only political party on the island and the only organization acting like a government. So, an important thing to end with here is in every aspect, the Jeju People's Committee was the only political party and the only government in Jeju. And it was, again, mostly communist. Generally, people are more interested in their daily lives than they are in politics. This is true. I agree with this completely. Most people are not ideologues. You'll hear me say that a lot. If life is good, people are normally not that concerned about politics. However, life was harsh for the Jeju people following liberation. After gaining independence, 60,000 Jeju citizens returned to the island from Japan, where many had been during the colonial period. Jobs on the island were scarce, society was unstable. Compounding the situation was the fact that the U.S. military government in Korea did not allow people returning from Japan to bring back money that they had earned there. Because remember, what did they say that we talked about in the last couple weeks? The U.S. wanted the Korean people to rely on the United States financially to keep them trapped into this cycle, right? During Japanese colonization, daily necessities were imported from Japan, but this was not possible after liberation. As a result, the economic situation for the Jeju people became dire. During the summer of 1946, Jeju suffered a cholera outbreak with around 50 cases a day. Islanders were dealing with drought-inflicted food shortage. And you'll remember we spoke about this a little bit, but the United States was not effectively handling food division, and one of their demands was let us handle food ourselves. You guys are not effective at governing our land. We can better handle food governance ourselves. And that was one of the demands that the People's Committee had against the Americans. They also don't talk about, well, I guess they will here. Conflict boiled over on March 1st, 1947, during an event to commemorate the March 1st independence movement. On March 1st, commemorative ceremonies were held nationwide, including in Seoul, to mark the 18th anniversary of the March 1st independence movement, and in Jeju, a March 1st independence movement event was held at Book Elementary School in Jeju City. Unlike in Seoul, where separate ceremonies were held by left-wing and right-wing groups, in Jeju, only one ceremony was held because there was no political conflict on the island. This led to an unprecedented number of people gathering and calling for unequivocal independence and a better society. Around 30,000 people gathered at Book Elementary School under the slogan, "Let's achieve unification, independence in the spirit of March 1st." The Korean people believed that they had suffered following independence due to lingering foreign control over the country's fate, the new neo-colonial model imposed on them by the USA. With the Soviet Union and the US, they did not really care about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, again, was not really there. Exercising control over the north and the south of the country, respectively, Koreans were also worried about a potential national division. As such division would likely lead to war, they called for unification and independence. This is a very interesting way this is framed, right? And if you listened again to the last 2 weeks, you know that this is not exactly how it went. It's technically not true, but it's not actually true. And this is, think about it, in our country, wherever you live, your country, this is how your history is written too. And it's easiest for us to look at how South Korean people understand their history through the lens of this legal framework that's been established where they're forced to lie, and also just through general pressure by the government there. And be like, this is so funny. It's like the story we get in the United States of the Native Americans. And then the Indians were happy. The white people came and they broke bread and shared dinner, and that was Thanksgiving. That's how we're told that story. This is exactly kind of how the mythology goes in every country, right? This is not limited to the ROK where they rewrite history in a way that is mythological, right? So, in other words, Koreans believed if they were able to establish an independent country free of foreign influence, the social conflict would naturally be resolved. This is, I think, correct. I think they were right to believe that. The tragic March 1st shooting incident occurred following a ceremony for the March 1st independence movement held at Book Elementary School. At around 2 p.m., as the ceremony came to a close, the crowd marched to Jeju Gwandeokjeong Pavilion. As the people were marching to the west of the pavilion, a boy was trampled by the horse of a mounted police officer. The crowd was enraged when the police officer ignored the injured boy, and some of them began pursuing the mounted policeman, throwing stones at him. People ran after the mounted police officer. He headed to a nearby police station. Police officers fired on the crowd from a watchtower. As a result, 6 civilians were killed and 6 more were injured. No one could have imagined this shooting incident would trigger the Jeju 4-3 uprising and massacre that would leave an estimated 30,000 people dead. I think they probably could have. ahead of the ceremony, and remember from last week, this was not out of nowhere. This was an incredibly tense period in Korea. And the United States at the same time was like, oh, there's a lot of communists here. We need to crush them. So that's what was going on in the broader context that's missed here. So the crowd was unarmed. The police fired into them. And then this launched a wave of protests that would follow basically from here. Oh, yeah, that's how we're taught it went. Colonization of the Americas. When I'm 40, so this was when I was a kid. That's how we were taught. Yeah. The Americans came over, and then they were like, wait, we don't know how to survive here. The winter is cold. Haha. And the Indians showed up and were like, we'll teach you. Eat dinner with us. And that was the first Thanksgiving. And they loved us, and we were friends. And that's literally how we're taught our history, right? Mm-hmm. And every country is doing some version of this with its history. And this is the line they have to straddle in the ROK. Now, keep in mind, too, the researchers know the truth. They know all the same stuff we know about it, but they can't say that, right? So, if the USA MGIK wanted to instill democracy in Korea, then it should have listened to the voice of agony of the Korean people. But the USA MGIK reacted in the opposite manner, designated Jeju an island of Reds, of communists, and began indiscriminately arresting people. Although the government blamed the influence of North Korea for the unrest and claimed that 90% of the Jeju people are leftists, recent research challenges this and indicates the whole island was enraged by the policies of the USA MGIK. That's the U.S. military government in Korea. There were some people who tried to find a rational solution for the situation. Here again, implying that it's not rational for the Korean people to want to expel the Americans from their land. It's very rational. Then Jeju Governor Park Kyung-hoon submitted his resignation in protest and stated that he took full responsibility for the situation. The statement he issued proclaimed, independence is not complete even after liberation, adding all 300,000 Jeju people are expressing condolences to the people killed in this tragic incident. These efforts were ineffectual, though. The U.S. military government in Korea ignored the public and continued to suppress the Jeju people. In the month following March 1st, around 500 people were arrested, 245 were detained. In the year leading up to the uprising in April 1948, 2,500 more would be arrested. This was not only most of Jeju's youth and educated population arrested by the USA MGIK, but also shows that the Jeju 4-3 uprising was not a sudden event, but was rooted in ongoing animosity against the U.S. military government in Korea. The Northwest Youth Association, Seobuk Cheongyendon, was formed by a group of landowners who were forced to leave North Korea due to the political climate there, including land reform and a crackdown on pro-Japanese factions. So these had been collaborators, right, in the North. They were therefore naturally hostile to left-wing groups. Remember, there's hardly any of them, right? There's hardly any collaborators. Having learned that Jeju was the island of Reds, they saw little wrong in killing the Jeju Islanders. So something interesting is that they're not going to mention it here. The Northwest Youth Association was the kids of the few wealthy landowners who had collaborated with the Japanese fascists in Korea when they colonized Korea. So these were fascists. And they actually were trained by people who had helped train like Nazi youth groups, basically. So this was like Hitler Youth, but in Korea. And they were trained by the same fascists who had worked with Japan and with Germany. So that's really important context that's not in here that I think we talk about on our podcast more. So they literally got together a fascist group of like Hitler Youth style people trained by people who had helped train Hitler Youth to go be released onto Jeju Island to kill Korean communists. Alongside police officers from the mainland, the Northwest Youth Association was deployed to Jeju Island after the shootings on March 1st under orders from the U.S. military government in Korea. So the U.S. military government in Korea, I just want to show you guys that the United States in South Korea occupying took rich kids who were fascists, okay? Think like red-pilled, like alt-right fascists with rich mommies and daddies, had them trained by people who helped train Hitler Youth groups and sent them, relocated them to Jeju Island to go kill people for fun, to go kill the poors for fun, basically. That's what really happened here, okay? That's how bad this was. Although they were given the title of police officers, they were not paid, and they sustained themselves through the looting of the people on the island. Because they didn't need to be paid. They were rich kids. They just did this for fun. When I say they did this for fun, they did this for fun. Taking responsibility for the March 10th general strike, Park Kyung-hun, the first Jeju governor under the U.S. military government in Korea, had resigned, but his successor, Yoo Hae-jin, assumed the position on April 10th, and it was during his governorship that the first 7 members of the Northwest Youth Association arrived on Jeju. And when I say there was hardly anybody, 7 people, right? The first 7, right? From that point until the start of the uprising in 1948, 760 members of the Northwest Youth Association entered the island, and another 1,700 would arrive later. So they started growing their ranks after that with more of these kind of right-wing, fascist-aligned people. But there was not very many of them on the peninsula at all. There's some quotes from people here who experienced it. Going on. April 3rd. So this is why it's called Jeju 4-3. April 3rd, 4-3, right? It was a month before the first election on May 10th. Oh, and also if you're not from the United States, you'll notice the dates are in what order? They're in the American order. That's how South Korea does their dates because of the American occupation, right? It was a month before the first election on May 10th, which was being held unilaterally in the South and would constitute the formation of the Republic of Korea. As outlined, Jeju Islanders had a great deal of anguish due to the oppression of the Northwest Youth Association, which was operating above the law. The election being held only in the southern half of the peninsula increased agitation over fears that the divided country would result in armed conflict. It was actually over fears that their country would be permanently divided. They were supposed to be one country. Oh, the text on screen hasn't changed? Oh, hold on. Let me fix this for you. Here it is. Sorry, thank you for letting me know. Yeah, it's been there since Guisokwan. Following the election, tensions escalated between the newly formed nations. Again, they should not have been multiple nations. And the Korean War would erupt only 2 years later. It is in this context that on April 3rd, 1948, 350 individuals on Jeju attacked police stations in part due to strong opposition to the division of the country. This is how, why, and when the Jeju 4-3 uprising and massacre began. On this day, 12 of the 24 police stations on the island were attacked, and 14 people were killed. The armed resistance announced, "Resist against oppression." Jeju Island was not the only place where this kind of uprising occurred. Many Koreans did not want a divided country, like every Korean, basically. Since national division risked further war, they have to kind of push this idea that the North is always about to attack them. That's like what their version of propaganda is in the South. But no, this was not. They just wanted their country and they wanted to expel the Americans. And in fact, we know that it was the people in the South, the military in the South under the United States, that was continuously aggressing against the North, not the other way around. When the uprising first occurred on Jeju, it seemed that the police force would be able to control the situation, the military would not be required. But there was no peaceful resolution, and Jeju Islanders faced a brutal crackdown. You guys have missed some pictures here, I'm so sorry. The police under the U.S. military government in Korea claimed the attacks against police stations on the morning of April 3rd, 1948 were committed by communists connected to the North. However, many people believed this to be a false accusation. It was false. We know through later documentation that these were all just people in the South. Public Prosecutor General Lee... Oh, but I want you to think about this. As early as 1948, the United States was trying to tell the people of Korea to fear the North. That the North were scary. That the North was coming in here and starting conflict. And this is the narrative that has persisted in the South since then. They are taught to fear the North. And this is why when we hear, it's illegal in the South to say anything positive about the North, blah, blah, blah. All the defector stories. The main target for these things is not actually the Western world. The main target for this propaganda is the southern half of Korea, right? So they do not want to reunify and rise up and expel the Americans. Kaltimu says, yes, ROK raised that the DPRK is always on the cusp of attacking, just like EU folks are raised on the narrative that Russia is always on the cusp of attacking. Exactly that. Mm-hmm. Iran will have nukes tomorrow for 20 years on 7 Row Gunner. Exactly. Public Prosecutor General Lee stated that the root cause of the unrest was unjust conduct of the U.S. military government in Korea. The quote here is, "The behavior of the wicked officers of the U.S. military government was the major cause of the incident." The Korea Constabulary was reluctant to intervene as it identified the conflict as being between Jeju Islanders and the police and the Northwest Youth Association. However, the U.S. military government dismissed this characterization and ordered the Korea Constabulary, which was under its purview, to crack down on the Jeju Islanders. And after a month, the Korean army executed this order. Meanwhile, Kim Ik-ryol, commander of the 9th Regiment, tried to resolve the situation peacefully. Less than a month after the attacks, negotiations were set up, and on April 28th, Kim and Kim Dal-sam, the head of the armed resistance group, reached a significant and potentially successful resolution after heated debate. They agreed upon a complete ceasefire within 72 hours, in addition to gradual disarmament and safety guarantees for the armed resistance groups. But the peace agreement was sabotaged 3 days later when an unidentified group of men disguised as members of the armed resistance set fire to the Orari villages in what is known as the arson of Orari. The USA MGIK documented the arson attack from the sky, and from the ground it was used in a propaganda film titled Chejo-do May Day. It was later found that the arson was committed by members of the Northwest Youth Association. So really think about this. So the Korean version of Hitler Youth went dressed up as communists and lit villages on fire on the island and tried to blame it on the communists. This is a type of casual political theater and espionage being done, right? It's destroying people's villages, killing people, whatever. That's happening. This is happening all the time. These types of false flag operations, etc., right? On May 3rd, the civilians who descended from the mountain regions, trusting the peace agreement, were shot by police who were disguised as members of the armed resistance group. The violence was planned so that the armed resistance groups would be blamed for breaking the ceasefire and annulling the peace agreement. This is still to this day what the ROK government tries to do to the North. The last president, not the current president, but the last president of South Korea, tried to provoke the North into attacking them so that he could justify martial law to lock up his political enemies in South Korea, and that was just a couple years ago. The USA MGIK dismissed Kim, who strongly criticized the situation, and replaced him as regimental commander with hardliner Park Jin-kyung. Park Jin-kyung served as a second lieutenant in the Japanese Army during the Japanese colonial period and was favored by Major General William F. Dean, commander of the U.S. military government in Korea and military governor of Korea. He took a completely different stance from Kim. At his inauguration, he said, "It is fine to sacrifice 300,000 to suppress a riot in Jeju, which hinders the independence of our nation." Now remember, this was not an independence movement like we think of it. This was not the people of Korea fighting for their independence. This was the people of the United States fighting to make half of Korea independent from the other half against the wishes of all of the Korean people. All right, so really keep that in mind. The independence of our nation, they're trying to balkanize Korea, basically. As Lord Oximus said, reminder, the No-Do-Do rally this Saturday is about the war game still being used against the DPRK by the ROK in the U.S. today. The Korean War never ended, exactly. So on May 10th, 1948, a general election for the Constitutional Assembly was held for the first time in the area that would be known as South Korea. So they were doing elections, and Kim Koo, the last premier of the provisional government of Korea during the Japanese colonial period, said, "Even though I collapsed on the 38th parallel, I cannot cooperate with the establishment of a divided country." Nobody was interested, right? This was the outbreak reason for the Jeju 4-3 uprising and massacre. I have some documents here. 2 governments in one country. There was the Republic of Korea that was formed on August 15th, 1948. Syngman Rhee became its first president. Then afterwards, North Korea had its own elections on September 9th. So I want you to really think about this too. How is this thing they have to leave some things up for you to just gather from the timelines. We're taught that the USSR came and occupied the North, and they divided the country in half and all this stuff or whatever here in the US. The South basically declared it was its own country having its own elections first. And then the USSR was like, okay, I guess we'll have our own elections, right? So then 3 weeks later, they had their own elections. That's how that worked. Yes, this is really important, as Virgo's saying. Something people don't often think about is how the Korean Peninsula was never divided. It was always Korea. South Korea and North Korea only existed because the United States wanted it. The 38th parallel cut off friends, families, co-workers from each other. There was no North and South mentality. There was just, we are Koreans, yeah. And towns were literally divided in half. These people did not want a North and South Korea. So imagine if you live in the United States, imagine your state, right? If you live in a smaller country, imagine your country. Just was cut in half at an arbitrary point one day, right? In the middle of towns. Would you think of yourself all of a sudden, like in California where I live, my state, I would not be like, well, I'm a Southern Californian. That would not occur to me. My family would probably be north, slightly north of the division line, right? where I grew up, Fresno would be my hometown. And I have a tattoo of on my chest, my hometown, 3 hours from me. That would be on the other half of the dividing line. That would be, Virgo and I would no longer live in the same state, right? You think about these things. They did not think of themselves like this. They thought of themselves as Korean. So then imagine all of a sudden, China comes, divides California in half for me. Our political enemy comes, divides our country in half, and then it's like, now you're having your Southern California elections to elect your new president of Southern California. Aren't you so excited? You'd be like, why the fuck is there a president of Southern California? What are you talking about? It would not make sense to you. And this is how they were feeling as well, right? So although this was a momentous chapter in Korean history, it would become a horror for the Jeju people. So President Ri wanted to remove any obstacles to his legitimacy. And remember, he had spent most of his life living in the United States. The United States flew him in. They were like, this is your guy now. He's going to be your president. Vote for him or else. And at the same time, President Ri was impatient because the UN process for approving a new government was scheduled for December 1948. But to be approved, domestic issues had to be resolved beforehand. So the U.S. military government of Korea, which was supposed to leave South Korea by the end of 1948, also was running out of patience. This is a painting here for those of you watching little. And these are, they say, suspected political criminals waiting to be interrogated. These people were executed. They were not waiting to be interrogated. These people were slaughtered. This is a very famous picture. They were slaughtered. Okay? So again, though, remember, they have to make sure they're not breaking the law with this stuff when they talk about it. Okay, not for me, thank you. The severe crackdown started October 27th, 1948, when Song Yo-chan, who was appointed the 9th Regimental Commander, announced in a decree that all land beyond 5 kilometers from the coast is hostile territory, and any individual entering the region will be killed unconditionally. This decree seriously violated human rights and resulted in the illegal killing of Jeju people. Such acts would have violated also the 1949 Geneva Convention, which stipulates prisoners of war and non-combatants must be treated humanely if it had been enforced at the time. On November 17th of that same year, martial law was declared. It was supposed to be temporary, right? But nobody really thinks that the situation on Jeju justified its imposition. Even in the imposition of martial law, if it had been justified, it still would have been illegal to kill people without due legal process. Nevertheless, most villages situated in the mid-region of Mount Halasan were burned, and all villagers unable to leave were brutally killed. No exceptions were made for women, children, or the elderly. The killings were illegal even during war, and this merciless carnage continued unchecked, and this was not during a time of war. At the start of the conflict, around 500 members of the armed resistance were identified by the military and the police, but 30,000 people were killed to punish those 500 people. And this is why people call this the era of madness, and the period continued until the spring of 1949. So that is the kind of history, right, of what went on there. Now, they have some interviews on this website, living memories of people who experienced it. We'll choose one person at random, and then we'll move on to the next. But this is a website you can spend a long time on, poking around and understanding more about this situation. So somebody give me a random number. First person to name a number under 50. We'll use it to count off and find a random testimony. 5. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to read the story of Yang Nam Ho. I am now age 76, and now may be the time to let it go. Steam rises, just like a sigh, just like the incense smoke. The spoon next to it resembles the lonely man who died alone. His wife served meals on the table for the missing soul. The bowl was heaped 3 times a day with newly cooked rice for 30 years, until she heard that her husband had died in jail. At the age of 27, Moon Im-sang, Yang's mother, was separated from her husband. This brass spoon was the only one Moon ever used. It was even the spoon she used for her last meal. All of her family used these pots and dishes when hiding on Mount Halasan to avoid being killed during suppression operations by the counterinsurgency forces. Since childhood, I have lived with the memory of 4-3. When I was 6, some state forces burned the village of Ora, and my family, and remember that's the Americans when you hear that, and my family, including my grandparents, my first uncle, my second uncle, my parents, and I, went up Mount Halasan to hide. Even after my relatives left the mountain, I stayed there with my mother a little longer. We used to wear a gambasi, a hat with earmuffs. Surviving the winter only with that hat, we cooked meals with these utensils. It was very, very cold in the winters, remember that. For 4 to 5 months, my mother repeatedly hiked up and down the mountain, carrying food we'd hidden in the dark. After returning to the village, we still used these pots until I graduated from middle school. My mother loved my father very much. Until she passed away, she had her meals only with this brass spoon. Every day she washed it carefully with rice straw and ashes. She kept it in the closet where she prepared the memorial table with food for my missing father for nearly 30 years, until she finally heard that he had died in Daejeon prison. She never let us prepare her birthday feast until she died in 2009. She used to say, "I was unable to prepare birthday meals for your grandparents. I don't deserve to have mine prepared for me." Or it dates back to a long time ago. Even if you hear it now, would it bring back any of the dead victims? Looking at relics like this, I cannot but feel sorry for my mother. I am now age 76, and now may be the time to let it go. So you'll see lots of stories like this. And it's very, very sad. All on this website. And I do recommend you check it out. And it is listed here under Guiza Guan's book for this section. Now, the next article we're going to read is about necropolitics at this time. Let me see if I got the full text PDF. I know I've downloaded it before. Here we go. Yes, this is a 22-page paper. So this will be the last thing we look at probably today. There are 2 more stories, and this is quite long. So I'm going to actually let us check out just a couple more things really fast, and we'll end on that. But this is a 104-page document from the CIA that's also linked here. And this talks about the Korean Labor Party. So this document has a lot of info that you can look at firsthand. This talks about the history from even when Japan was there about the Korean Labor Party, what's going on, right? So this is another document that you can get super lost in as well if you would like to read this on your own. This is still 1925. Hold on, we're scrolling through time. So we're going to just read a little bit about this here. And I think that there's going to be more info later on here. In 1946, as an international line, the merger of communist parties and socialist left-wing parties was carried out in East European countries and in Korea. So remember we were reading the Third International piece last week, chat, and they were like, hey, just have one communist party from every country. Get your shit together and consolidate. This is kind of what they're talking about, that same vibe. In Korea, the group in North Korea first proposed merger with the North Korean branch of the Korean Communist Party, followed by proposal in South Korea by the Korean Communist Party to the People's Party. Since the merger plan was according to international line, it was carried out without any research or deliberations. And remember, this is 1946, so at the same time that all of this is happening. In North Korea, the merger was carried out smoothly, according to plan. Thus, communists in North Korea were able to establish the North Korean Labor Party, which was equal to the South Korean Labor Party of communists in South Korea. But the dream of Kim Il-sung to have this was half realized, they say. Kim Il-sung lost by death through illness 2 of his valuable assistants. And this talks about kind of the formation of the party. This is a really interesting piece of history here. The situation in South Korea, they say, however, differed from North Korea. In North Korea, the party held the reins of the government within the army and the police providing material control power. But in South Korea, Pak Hon-young had no material power other than party regulations. Kim Il-sung had been promoting agitation, they said, by supplying political funds to the anti-Pak Hon-young faction in South Korea. And they say Kim Il-sung impetuously plotted to take over the hegemony and merge the parties. But really what was happening is the North was just financing, funding as best they could the South Korean rebellions movements. So they're kind of talking about what's going on here in South Korea. We're talking about the formation of the parties here, which is very, very fascinating. The Social Labor Party. We're going to carry on a little bit more. So this talks about more of the era of Kim Il-sung. So this is more in the north. So it's a little bit less what we had going on today. I wonder if I should put this somewhere else, actually. In a different section as we're going. Here we go. This is the section. So this talks about the offenses by the U.S. forces, fighting against, the outbreak of the war, etc., all in here. So this is 104 pages of CIA documents in here, and it's organized by date and subject, and some of them are really, really hard to see. But the reason why this is included is so you understand the full scope of the communist presence in South Korea. So you understand it was not just a thing happening in the North. It was a thing that was very actively happening in the South as well. You know, and this was, so this idea that, I don't know, it wasn't anti-communist killings or that communism was not popular in North Korea. That's a lie, right? So this is so you really understand that. So I'm actually going to add this here with a little bit of context. All right. So the next thing we're going to look at before we get into reading this whole article is this little article, which is a more pop kind of piece, right? This is South Korea's Forgotten Anti-Communist Killings. Do you recognize this picture? This is, hold on, same picture right here that we saw. So this is written by Subin Kim. And this says, 75 years after the Jeju Island massacres, this is from 2023, descendants of the dead sue for justice. Now this is... again, the same picture taken from there. Jeju-do is a small island off the Korean peninsula's rugged southern coast. Every year, the island welcomes millions of visitors who are drawn to its natural beauty and seeming tranquility. Attractions abound. The dolrebang, beanie-clad statues with bulging features carved out of basalt. The hainyo, elderly female divers who fetch abalone and mollusks from the sea. The halabong, a pear-shaped variety of tangerine crossbred from various citruses to maximize its sweetness. North Korean missiles have been used to hit Kiev today. Interesting. The flight between Jeju and Seoul, South Korea's capital, is the busiest domestic air route in the world. In 2022 alone, the island hosted nearly 20 times more visitors than inhabitants. But both my father and my late grandfather were born and raised on Jeju, and they know that its reputation as an idyllic holiday destination belies a more complicated history. On the morning of April 4th, Hyun Soo-un, a well-known calligrapher on the island, entered the Jeju District Courthouse, a nondescript building in the island's administrative center, about 2 miles from the tourist circuit. Early spring showers had streaked its granite facades and sprinkled its rain-glazed steps with cherry blossom petals. The courtroom on the second floor was small and wood-paneled, with a gallery that held a handful of reporters from local dailies and some older spectators. For years, Hyun inscribed Buddhist maxims on hanging scrolls to display in exhibitions. He now likes to give away his work to people celebrating new beginnings, like graduates or newlyweds, and his ink brush letterings often spell out words to live by for a prosperous future. On that day, he was at the courthouse to recall a dark, distant past. His late uncle, who had disappeared 75 years ago, was being retired in absentia. In 1948, Hyun's uncle was arrested somewhere in the mountains of Jeju and found guilty of rebellion. He was then transported to a prison in Mokpo, a city on the southern tip of mainland Korea, to serve a 15-year sentence, and he never returned. 29 other islanders who had faced similar fates were being jointly retried along with Hyun's uncle. Sorry, I said retired actually earlier by accident, retried. 6 of them had also been guilty of rebellion, and the rest had been found guilty of espionage or collaboration with the enemy. All were presumed dead. They either died in prison or vanished during the Korean War, which broke out not long after their imprisonment. Hyun sat down next to family members of the other defendants in the row of seats against the bar. On each of their minds was a deceased father, uncle, grandfather, whom they knew not as a criminal, but as a victim of ideologically driven state violence. With the retrial, it was beginning to sink in that their father, uncle, or grandfather had been convicted of trumped-up charges during a series of massacres on the island. While the massacres continue to be debated today by conservatives looking for political fodder, in the early aughts, a liberal government began investigating and making public the extent of state violence that had occurred. Now, 75 years after the false convictions, the government has claimed responsibility for the atrocities. Hyun and other descendants of the formerly charged watch as state prosecutors brought retrials for posthumous declarations of independence. The massacres on Jeju, which took place between 1947 and 1954, resulted in the second largest death toll of civilians in Korea's contemporary history after the Korean War. Tallies vary. At least 15,000 people are known to have been killed, but historians say the real number could be as high as 30,000 or more. In a tight-knit society like Jeju's, this means virtually every family on the island, including mine, knows someone who died in the events. In October 1948, a few months after he was elected the first president of South Korea, the U.S.-backed Syngman Rhee signed off a scorched earth policy to completely root out Jeju's communist agitators. In the ensuing months, tens of thousands of thatched roof houses went up in smoke. The violence began during an Independence Day celebration in 1947, when a small child was kicked by a mounted police officer's horse. We talked about this in the last one, right? You guys should remember this. The casual barbarity of the scene provoked onlookers to swarm the officer and follow him to the police station. The police mistook the swarm for an ambush and fired into the crowd, killing 6 civilians. 9 days later, the islanders staged a general strike against police violence. The strike abated before the end of the month, but tensions persisted. Clashes between the police and the public grew more frequent as time wore on, and police presence on the island was fortified by members of right-wing youth associations who apprehended and beat members of leftist parties upon arriving on Jeju. In response, the Workers' Party of South Korea, a communist party, planned an uprising of about 350 armed men from Jeju. And that's the CIA document we were looking for that's about the Korean Labor Party. That goes through the Workers' Party of South Korea as well. So if you read through this 104-page document, it's quite a bit. We're not going to have time, unfortunately, to get through it today. But you'll see documentation of that party. So that's why it's included in this section. The rebellion had 2 goals. The first was to stem the havoc that the right-wing groups were causing. The second was to protest the upcoming presidential election in May. This election will form a government for the U.S.-controlled southern half of the country and solidify the partition of Korea into North and South, against the wishes of many Koreans who understood the division to be a temporary arrangement between the Soviet Union and the U.S. Many also resisted the control of the U.S. military government, which was the official ruling body of Southern Korea from September 1945 to August of 1948. The election was held as scheduled, but turnout in 2 of Jeju's electoral districts failed to meet the minimum voter threshold and was thus declared invalid, which aggravated authorities. Why? Because they protested it. They didn't show up to vote. They wouldn't do it, right? As London's Besgay says, burning thatched roofs is an absurdly frequent scene of imperialist violence. This is so true. It's raining outside, chat. It's raining in August in LA. It's so weird. The U.S. military government dispatched Colonel Rothwell H. Brown to the island to oversee all police and military operations as top commander. Brown, who had called Jeju a base for communists in a letter to his division leader, stationed battalions from the Korean constabulary throughout the island, with American officers directing on the front lines. Brown ordered extensive searches to ferret out the 350 armed rebels, but ended up arresting thousands of innocent villagers. In October 1948, a few months after he was elected the first president of South Korea, the U.S.-backed Syngman Rhee signed off on the scorched earth policy. In the ensuing months, tens of thousands of thatched roof houses went up in smoke, following the order to burn everything more than 5 kilometers from the coastline. Paramilitaries poured onto the island on Rhee's orders, slaughtering the villagers indiscriminately, carrying out mass executions on promontories from which bodies plunged into the sea and washed away. Hyun and his family lived in Sumang-ri, a village located on a south-facing patch of Mount Hala, a volcanic mountain that peaks roughly at the island center. As flames engulfed the lowlands, Hyun climbed higher and higher before holding up in the mountain's lava tubes to escape the carnage. He was just 12 years old at the time. Once the winter passed, word spread that the killing spree had ground to a halt, and anyone who immediately descended the mountain would be spared. Thousands of villagers who had managed to survive the blistering cold followed this promise down the mountain, waving a piece of white cloth tied to a broken tree branch. Instead of amnesty, awaiting the villagers at the foot were soldiers who captured them. Hyun made it safely to the shore, but his 23-year-old uncle was shoehorned by soldiers into an old factory before receiving his sentence. Because Jeju had no prisons of its own at the time, the detainees were shipped to mainland Korea and scattered to 15 prisons across the country. That was the last Hyun heard of his uncle. An informal practice of guilt by association called Yeondwaje punished the relatives of the convicted and was not explicitly outlawed until 1980. This meant that silence was the only way they could keep their families safe. Now think about this. This is what we hear about North Korea, right? We hear that 3 generations of punishment in North Korea. Every accusation is a confession, right? They're projecting. What actually was happening is that in South Korea, guilt by association was legal until the year 1980. So that's what was happening in South Korea under American occupation. Many, like Hyun's uncle, went missing. Most died. Others served their sentences and were released. Some prisoners broke free amid the chaos of the Korean War, eluding soldiers from the North Korean army who pried open the gates for recruiters. This is what happened to my grandfather, who escaped to prison for teenage captives in Incheon and made the long journey down south. But due to the anti-communist agenda that persisted for decades, the misery continued. Back in his hometown, he was placed on a government watch list of subversives, along with other former prisoners who had survived and returned. Plainclothes officers surveilled them, suspicious of communist sympathies that might incite another uprising. There wasn't much the former prisoners could do to reverse the designation. Amid long years of authoritarian rule and anti-communist sloganeering, the fear of getting red-baited again resigned them to silence. The footprint of this history spans generations. Records of these villagers' incarceration show up on their children's background checks, and the children, as a result, are barred from employment in certain white-collar or government professions. An informal practice of guilt by association called Yuang Zhuaje punished the relatives of the convicted and was not explicitly outlawed until 1980. This meant that silence was the only way they could keep their families safe, and the suffering contained, which it turned stifled the kind of public outcry that would have been necessary to prove their innocence. Jeju did not regain peace until September 1954, when the directive prohibiting entry to sections of Mount Hala was lifted. Once it did, the island readied itself for visitors without much historical reckoning. A new network of roads encircled the mountain, and hotels and guest houses opened on the seafront. By the 1990s, the island, once a site of bloodshed, had transformed into a honeymoon destination. In the winter of 1998, Kim Jae-soon, then a researcher at the National Archives of Korea, spent his days rooting around in the archives, unspooling rolls of microfilm. His job was to find noteworthy but overlooked events that could shore up support for passing the Public Records Management Act, which would mandate the preservation of records created by public institutions and prohibit their willful destruction or suppression. The need for such a law had come to light in a scandal during the previous year's presidential election when rafts of documents were spirited away. Because the president-elect, the dissident-turned-politician Kim Dae-jang, had slipped in a promise to investigate what happened on Jeju as one of his 170 campaign pledges, Kim Jae-soon turned his attention to the massacres and combed relevant files. One day, Kim Jae-soon happened upon a curious list of names and verdicts that had been scanned onto microfilm. The names were jotted in slapdash handwriting, and the sentences ranged from 1 year to life in prison, and in some cases, death. They'd stood trial by the hundreds, each unfolding in a matter of not even days, but hours, Kim recalled. Unable to find the corresponding judgments, he was convinced that they were arbitrary executions of civilians and not legitimate trials. At first, Kim could not tell his colleagues. Leftist incidents were still taboo for civil servants to discuss, he said. For decades, those accused of harboring communist sympathies had been met not just with mockery and ostracism, but with government interrogation. There was an unspoken rule of avoiding public discussion of disputed historical events, especially when they involved communist associations. But instead of burying his discovery in safe, stony silence, Kim made photocopies of the microfilm and studied the massacre for months, calling up every reporter and scholar he could find with expertise in the events. Nearly a year after finding the microfilm, Kim knocked on the office door of Assembly member Chu Mi-rae, a former judge and freshman legislator in Kim Dae-jung's party, and shared with her what he had discovered. 2 days later, they traveled to Busan, a port city where the ledger had been kept in a branch facility of the National Archives since the 1970s, when it had been transferred from the Jeju District Prosecutor's Office. Sandwiched between other court judgments was a list Kim had seen reproduced on microfilm. Its yellowing pages were dense with 1,650 names in handwritten ink script, noting their age, occupation, home address, sentence, and assigned prison. These lists were interspersed with brief summaries of the trial scribbled on loose-leaf notes. Another ledger brought the total up to 2,530. First held in December 1948, these court-martial trials had been carried out under martial law, the islanders charged with rebellion. The charges in the second run of trials, which took place in the summer of 1949, were collaboration with the enemy and espionage, and criminal violation of 2 provisions of the National Security Act. And that's the act, again, chat, that makes it illegal to say anything positive or do anything nice about the North or communism or socialism. So, also, if you talk about North Korea, one of the things you'll notice is people from South Korea losing their minds in your comment sections on videos, online. They're like, what are you talking about? Like, how could you say this? And when I tell you they are extremely propagandized, this is the kind of reason why, right? They have internet provisions that don't allow them access to information from the outside. So if they're on American social media apps and they hear us saying something like this, not from the ROK, it's usually not the same version of history they're getting taught, right? And they're very, very surprised to hear it because a lot of this stuff can be illegal. Studying the dates and legal basis for the proceedings, Kim could see the extrajudicial nature of the trials, which had gone unquestioned because they'd happened quickly and without due process. Martial law has been invoked for the first round of the trials, but the legislation that allowed the government to proclaim martial law wasn't established until 1949. Likewise, the National Security Act, under which 1,659 of the defendants were tried, was enacted by the U.S. military government of Korea, which had ceased to be an official ruling body in August of 1948, almost a year before the second series of trials took place. The law was later codified into South Korea's constitutional law in 1954, though. Such details about the massacres were suppressed, but memories had surfaced in veiled or fictional terms. In 1957, Kim Sok-pom, who was born in Osaka to immigrants from Jeju, wrote a short story called Death of a Crow that was inspired by testimonies from his neighbors who had fled the island. The protagonist of the story shoots a crow as a symbolic gesture of resistance while working on Jeju as a translator for the U.S. military. Written in Japanese, the story went out of print before it could reach Korea. First to break the silence in Korea was a 1978 publication of Hyun Ki-young's short story Suni Sam-chan in Chengbai, a quarterly literary magazine that's still active today. The story follows a man who returns to his hometown to discover that his family's housekeeper, Aunt Suni, has taken her own life, 30 years after being the sole survivor of the massacre in her village. The story is based on the history of Bokchon-ri, a village of about 300 that was razed by the military after armed rebels killed 2 soldiers. When I met Hyun on the outskirts of Seoul, where he now resides, he showed me a disfigured fingernail. Shortly after the story was published, he told me, agents from the Korean Central Intelligence Agency appeared at his day job as a school teacher. For 3 days, he was detained in a basement, where an agent repeatedly struck his limbs with an aluminum bat. The beating left his fingernail permanently twisted to one side. He was not subjected to questioning, he said. He was simply told to stop writing inflammatory stories. So think about this. In 1978, the first man who wrote about this wrote a short story just mentioning that this had occurred. And what happens? The Korean government shows up at his door, abducts him, and tortures him for days and tells him to stop talking about it. So when we say people were afraid to talk about this, they were, and they're still afraid to word it in the wrong way, to say something that's a little too sympathetic. So recent, right? And this was still 1978. 2 years later is when they outlawed guilty by association in South Korea. Mm-hmm. So when people from the ROK are like, what are you guys talking about? They've never in their lives heard somebody say something nice about communism. They can't, right? It's illegal where they live. You'll get beaten. So they are very, very shocked to hear like people are actually communists. That people understand the North to be a decolonial government. Only the people that are very, very old in Korea today remember the division maybe. They were kids when it happened. They are still fighting for unification, a lot of them. A lot of the younger people though, they have grown up only knowing propaganda. So we have the older generation who knows the truth but are scared into silence because they don't want to be beaten and abducted. We have the younger generation who's only grown up in the propagandized world where they don't hear people telling the truth out of that fear, right? So that's created the conditions for the people in the South and their understanding of their own country, of their own history. Or a handful of forced defectors paid by the United States, the media, and the South Korean government to tell them, oh, you're so lucky you're in the South, man. North Korea is horrible. You'd hate it up there. So upon his release, Hyun found that he had a small following of students who had read the story. They made photocopies of his work and distributed it amongst themselves. It became a primer for people interested in studying what had happened in Jeju. In 1989, he formed the Jeju 4-3 Research Institute, an organization dedicated to researching and advancing discourse around the massacres. In its early years, most of the 4-3 Research Institute's members were people who wanted to write poems or literature about the massacres. But there was one young college graduate among them who would go on to produce pivotal evidence for the retrials. Kim Yun-hee, a Jeju native who speaks with a practiced calm, now leads the investigations group at the Jeju 4-3 Peace Foundation. She's been recording testimonies of survivors of the massacres that their relatives for 3 decades. I don't keep count, she told me, but estimates that she has recorded around 2,500 testimonies in total. She credited her work to the 1987's June Democratic Struggle, when student-led pro-democracy demonstrations swept the nation. As college students challenged the Chun Doo-hwan regime's censorship with new fervor, Kim, who was then studying history at Jeju National University, was approached by upperclassmen about joining a book club. They said they were studying the truth about what had happened on Jeju. Kim remembered that her high school history textbook had labeled the incident a riot. She never questioned the description. Her grandmother had spoken of rioters who'd swarmed down the mountain and torched her house. But all of my friends said that their villages were butchered by the military, not rioters, she told me. Baffled, she wondered, had she been living with a false sense of reality? Of course, that seems to be similar in Ukraine. Teens have lived their whole life under Nazi government, being fed anti-Russian propaganda. Yep, I say if you're under the age of 35 in Ukraine, you probably don't know a world that's not like USAGM kind of propaganda, National Endowment for Democracy propaganda that really started picking up steam, in 2010. She began visiting villagers in the village on Jeju under the guise of a student compiling oral histories, sometimes with a secret voice recorder in her pocket. She didn't tell them exactly what the oral histories were for. At first, they would demur, but with a little prodding, the stories would spill out. 4 out of 5 conversations would eventually lead to a massacre, she said. Through her inquiry, she learned the extent of the violence. Kim's village, Wimiri, was one of the few that had been set ablaze by armed rebels who targeted villages that cooperated with the police and the army. The police and the army, however, were responsible for over 80% of the deaths and destruction on Jeju, according to figures from the Jeju 4-3 investigation report. So think about that. The villagers are fighting back against the U.S. fascist occupation of their land. It's this fight between the villagers trying to expel them. What's the division of violence? You would think 50-50, right? No. 80% the United States and our fascist allies. 20% what the villagers were able to fight back with, right? Maurer says, I know a handful of moderate woke youths in Ukraine. They're pretty wise to what the nationalists are doing, but few and far between. Well, it's promising at least. Survivors spoke of brutal rape and murder, torture during interrogations, macabre scenes of corpses piling up for incineration. Ko Sang-bong, who was 74 years old at the time of her testimony, recalled how her aunt and 2 nephews were speared to death. It's going to get really brutal, just so you guys know. Her aunt was pregnant, and when the spear was retracted, her unborn child was torn out, impaled. I buried the 4 of them side by side, Ko said. Her husband was captured and said to be sent to a prison in Daejeon, but he might have been thrown into the sea. The trauma that haunted survivors led to more suffering. Ko Min-ja spoke of her husband, who was driven to suicide by the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. His whole family was killed before his eyes, she said in a testimony in 2004. By the late 1990s, there were enough testimonies for the brutality to be irrefutable, and Jeju-based activist groups pressed President Kim Dae-jung once more to deliver on his campaign promise before the turn of the millennium. In January 2000, he signed the Jeju 4-3 special law, which commissioned an investigation. Over the course of the next 3 years, officials assembled a 700-page report documenting the sequence of events in granular detail. Kim's successor, President Roh Moo-hyun, issued an official apology on behalf of the state. During Roh's term, islanders who had served prison sentences were included in the category of victims for the first time and could request a retrial. But then came a conservative shift in the political winds. The most ardent supporters of conservative presidents from 2008 to 2017, who rallied around the archaic view of communism as an existential threat, still believed that the instigators of the massacres were communist rioters. To address the injustice of the massacres would prove otherwise, and thus the issue was avoided. It was only after the Liberal President Moon Jae-in came into power in 2017 that progress resumed. Another amendment passed in 2021 recognizing the faults in the criminal procedure of the court-martial trials and promising much-delayed justice. The amendment, which fully addressed the state's role in the tragedy, made it the government's responsibility to initiate the proceedings for the defendants from the court-martial trials, unburdening family members from having to meet the tough conditions for retrial or hire their own lawyer. In the Jeju District Courthouse this past April, all 30 defendants received posthumous declarations of innocence. At the time of the writing, over 1,000 sentences from the court-martial trials had been overturned, 30 defendants at a time, in bi-weekly retrials since March 2022. The rest, which at some point will include my grandfather, will take about 1 more year. From the task force of 9 officials assigned to the retrials, one of the prosecutors is a Jeju native who can decipher documents recorded in the island's dialect, which is unintelligible to speakers of standard Korean and is still widely used by the elderly islanders who make up most of the defendants' immediate family members. Whether they are declared innocent or not, financial compensation is dispensed to all who fall under the definition of a victim. The amount is capped at 90 million South Korean won, or $67,000. Once they've reclaimed their innocence, they or their descendants can individually apply for reparations, the sum of which will rise with the number of days they were imprisoned. The first former inmate to receive reparations received a total of 154.6 million South Korean won for 450 days wrongfully in prison. In the majority of cases, the money goes to descendants, since most of the former prisoners are no longer alive. It could be a small windfall, but money is hardly the first thing on the mind of Hyun Sun-hun, the calligrapher. Now that his uncle's spirit is finally able to rest in peace, Hyun told me that the government should try to find his uncle's remains in the vicinity of the prison of Mokpo. 3 trials have offered a kind of closure. Before the verdicts are read, family members and attendants get a chance to speak. When his turn came, Hyun rose to his feet. He addressed the judge at length about making a wise decision and said, "A line was drawn, and everyone to the mountainous side was deemed left wing, and everyone to the shore right wing." He recited the same line to me after the trial as if he had rehearsed it countless times. Others had taken the time to share their stories and release grief. One defendant's son stood up to talk about being raised by his grandmother after his entire family was killed. Another defendant's grandson said he was overcome by sadness to learn the truth about why his father had grown up fatherless. The legal recognition of the islanders' innocence consoles the dead and the living. This reckoning process remains contentious. Since the conservative government regained power in 2022, a litany of revisionism has swept the island. 1 month before the 75th anniversary of the massacres this year, Bae Young-ho, a former North Korean diplomat who's now a conservative lawmaker in South Korea, claimed during a campaign stop on the island that the Jeju uprising was triggered on the orders of Kim Il-sung. It's a conspiracy theory, right? Founder of North Korea. That's a conspiracy theory. And this is the kind of man who Bae Young-ho is often talked about as being a defector that's trustworthy in the South. He's going here lying. We know this is a lie. We know this isn't true. No documentation supports this claim, right? So these defectors are liars. They become professional right-wing grifters, just like him. He's a right-wing politician, a very far-right politician in South Korea. Just like Yeonmi Park is right-wing and says that Donald Trump is going to save Korea, and she, was part of Turning Point USA, the Charlie Kirk org. Seizing on the opportunity, far-right groups banded together to string some 80 banners across the island, calling the massacres a communist riot. So again, when we tell you hating North Korea is a very right-wing position, it's an extremely far-right position. The complexity of the events makes the massacres easy to oversimplify and hyperbolize. The "they are Hamas, they are Kim Il-sung" phenomena, as Seawolf says. Yep. Long history of suppression has emboldened fringe groups to distort the events for publicity, especially in a political climate in which they are not forcibly condemned. Following adamant protests from local government officials, the far-right banners were removed only a few days before April 3rd, when the annual memorial ceremony was held at 4-3 Peace Park. From early morning, mourners laid white chrysanthemums at the foot of the tablet engraved with the victims' names. Some scrubbed the pedestals clean, and others placed atop them a plate of uncut fruit, stacked rice cakes, and a bottle of liquor, a ritual honoring the departed. The solemn occasion was interrupted by an unwelcome guest, who claimed to have revived the Northwest Youth League. Remember? Hitler Youth. Korean Hitler Youth. An ultra-right paramilitary group responsible for some of the worst atrocities inflicted on civilian islanders during the massacres. Driving by in a minivan, he filmed the crowd as they demanded that he leave, and later uploaded the clip to his YouTube channel. So, why is this telling of events compared to the official 4-3 website a little more upfront and honest? Well, it's because Soo-bin Kim is not a South Korean citizen. She lives in Toronto, Canada. So note the difference, just the subtle difference in language and how things are presented between the two accounts, right? You wonder if, Kaltimov says, as the Western attitude about the DPRK changes, it's complicated will become the centrist mantra once again like it was with Palestine. I think so. They're already starting to be like, well, okay, fine, maybe the United States did horrible things to Korea, but two things can be true at once. They're already starting to get there. Yeah. Lennox says, Yeonmi Park has literally said, college is too liberal and it reminds her of North Korea. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've got 25 minutes left to get into this article, which is Vida Hyunjin Kim from Critical Asian Studies out of Rutledge. And Rutledge also is the name of the university where Susie Kim is a professor. It's interesting. But this is the Taylor and Francis. And you can download this for free. Here, Taylor and Francis online. Okay. So, we're going to read through as much of this as we can get through today. The 2024 Martial Law Declaration and Necropolitical Living Under South Korean Sub-Imperialism. So this is an academic article, so it's going to be a little bit more dry for us to end on, okay? So we've got the abstract here, which says, this article situates the recent imposition of martial law in South Korea. And remember, this is from 2025. Remember, the former president, who's no longer president, declared martial law after trying to provoke North Korea into attacking South Korea. This was just like a couple years ago, maybe a year ago, so that he could use it as justification to basically abduct his political enemies and like terrorize them. So that's what they're talking about here with martial law. The article situates the recent imposition of martial law in South Korea with a long history of mass deaths driven by the structure of South Korean sub-imperialism and its necropolitical core. The constitutive elements of necro power include, number 1, invoking the presence of an enemy, number 2, the maximal and proactive production of mass deaths, number 3, disciplining the population into living dead figures adhering to the powerful, and 4, entanglement with colonialism and imperialism. Necropower was first entrenched during the Jeju Genocide. So you see, this is written in 2025. Times moved on a little bit more. What are we calling it? The Genocide now. Now it's called the Genocide. Those articles were a little bit older. 2018, 2019, 2022 kind of vibes. So now we call it a genocide. And became a foundational component of South Korea's development as a sub-empire state articulated with the U.S. empire state. Necropolitics in South Korean sub-imperialism were structured through constitutive agency. First by right-wing elites who subjected themselves under U.S. imperialism and directed the elimination of those labeled as communist terrorists, and later by Southern Koreans co-opted by right-wing associations. Those who merely subsist without transformative agency inadvertently perpetuate the structure of South Korean sub-imperialism fraught with necro power. To elucidate the possibilities of transformative agency, this essay concludes with a mediation on the 2024 Nobel Laureate lecture by Han Kang. All right, everybody ready? It's going to be an intense one, but that's okay. We'll see how much we get through again. I'm going to take a little drink of coffee. I'm going to pep myself up, give me some energy before we get into this one. All right, let's go. So this is written by somebody out of Ohio. So again, we're going to get less of the National Security Act. It's not really going to be relevant. We can tell by the name this is somebody of Korean descent. So a lot of this work has been done by members of the Korean diaspora. So, usually when we see diaspora members of communities that have suffered imperialism, they're doing political work on behalf of empire, right? For the Korean diaspora, a lot of the activism work, the left-wing activism work, has been kept alive by the Korean diaspora. So note it all out here, that's Korean diaspora work, right? We have a lot of researchers unveiling the stuff that's Korean diaspora. And I think a lot of it is because they know in South Korea people can't do the work, and in North Korea they've been shunned by the rest of the world. So this essay engages history of the present, specifically about the South Korean state fraught with genocidal violence, which became evident in its most recent iteration as the planned violence embedded in a thwarted martial law attempt on December 3rd, 2024. Although the December 3rd martial law declaration proved to be short-lived, subsequent investigations by prosecutors and journalists have uncovered substantial evidence suggesting that this episode could have led to a bloodbath. Then-President Yoon Suk-yeol and his entourage meticulously planned the imposition of martial law for months. The plan included, and again, this is 2024 December, the plan included kidnapping, torturing, and murdering 500 opponents in South Korea, including parliamentary politicians, trade union organizers, journalists, and religious leaders. Really, I want you guys to really, if you weren't aware of this, really process this. In 2024 December, like a year and a half ago, the president of South Korea tried to provoke North Korea into an attack as an excuse to declare martial law, which he did declare martial law, the North did not attack, in order to abduct, kidnap, torture, and murder 500 political opponents. That's wild. This is wild that this story even happened. This is one of the wildest stories that I've seen come out of the news recently at all, right? Who did he want to abduct? Other politicians in their parliament. He wanted to kidnap, torture, and murder other politicians in their parliament, as well as trade unionists, journalists, and religious leaders. All right? So, yeah. According to a planning document written by Yoon's co-conspirator, No Sang-won, the targets could have easily been as many as 10,000 people. Troops in various parts of the country were commanded to stand by. Some of them were dispatched to key political institutions, including the National Election Commission. Hundreds of soldiers carrying live ammunition entered the National Assembly building. Had large-scale protests not been staged immediately following the imposition of martial law, and had the original plan been carried out, the outcome would have resulted in carnage. This reveals a sobering truth. The salience of a politics predicated on mass killing, despite South Korea's nominal transition to democracy that presumably guarantees enhanced human rights. As Nan Kim discusses in her introduction to this thematic section, Yoon's decree recalled for many South Koreans the historical trauma that followed the 1980 military crackdown on a popular uprising that resulted in the Gwangju massacre. However, such necropower in South Korea did not originate during the military dictatorship of the 1960s to the 1980s. To grasp the structural implications laid bare by the recent martial law crisis, it is essential to recognize how necropolitics in South Korea is rooted in the country's foundational years. In this essay, I highlight how unsurprising this attempted coup was when viewed through the lens of the socio-historical structure of South Korea's state formation. So remember, this is something that Gui-suk Won writes about as well, but from South Korea, so it's a little more stunted, or not stunted, I'm going to say, it's a little more tempered, right? This is going to be the same thing, though. It's about state formation, how it all ties into the building of the state. Maurer says basically every South Korean president has either been killed, jailed, or exiled. Yeah, and it's so wild that we are taught that they're a great, thriving, functioning democracy somehow. How is the necropolitical state of the mid-20th century relevant to the machinations surrounding Yoon's unshocking attempt to impose martial law in the early 21st century, which seemed utterly incongruous with South Korea's presumed place in the contemporary world as an apparently stable liberal democracy? One clue can be found in Yoon's repeated use of the phrase anti-state forces since early in his time in office. Yoon used this phrase to justify his martial law declaration when characterizing his domestic opponents as pro-North, anti-state elements. As Jae Jung-seo notes in his essay in this issue, Yoon invoked national security interests as a pretext for his extreme actions, when in fact these were motivated by efforts to deflect attention away from himself and his wife in a criminal prosecution. I know Fork's mad at something. I think my neighbor's dog's barking. While Yoon's repeated use of the term anti-state has widely reported in the domestic and international media, far less attention has been directed to how his use of the term anti-state forces drew from South Korea's national security law, first instituted in 1948. Like any legal instrument, this law is socially and historically embedded, particularly in the period of mass violence that occurred on Jeju Island between 1947 to 1954. This socio-historical foundation and its ongoing relevance remains central to understanding the present. Now, I want to take a second to pause and just think about this. You guys know there's a TikToker, Danny North Korea, who was once asked something about South Korea and said, well, I don't know anything about South Korea, I only know about the North. And people found this shocking, right? Because you cannot, to know about North Korea is to know about South Korea. For a number of reasons. Number one, the country was not even supposed to be divided. It's one country, and the South is under illegal occupation, and the North is the legitimate indigenous and sovereign government of that country, right? So what do you mean you only know about half of the country, and you want people to think you're an expert on this? You have a whole TikTok account dedicated to it? You only know about half of it. That's weird. The second thing, though, is this. Because North Korea has been so effectively cut off by the rest of the world, and remember that. North Korea has not chosen to remove itself from the rest of the world. Countries that have diplomatic relationships with North Korea have diplomatic relationships with North Korea, right? But those countries are also shunned by the West largely. The Western world has sought to shun and isolate North Korea. That means that the Western world doesn't get a lot of access to information about North Korea except for through the South. So to know about North Korea, you have to understand the laws like the National Security Act and the history and the politics of South Korea that is shaping the lens through which our entire understanding in the Western world comes of North Korea. South Korea is the filter, the disseminator of information. Think about it. Anytime you hear information about North Korea, what's the location of the news story say? It says Seoul. It says Seoul. It's coming out of South Korea. When we get intelligence reports in Amnesty International, where is it coming from? South Korean intelligence agencies. So the person telling you the information about the North is the South most of the time. right? Or defectors living in South who have to live under these laws. So if you don't understand the laws and the political structure of South Korea, how are you able to adequately interpret the political context for the information they are giving you about the North? And they are the ones giving us a lot of the information about the North. They're working in conjunction with the U.S. to do this. So this section that we're going to get into is the necropower section. In this section, I introduce Akil Mbembe's notion of necropower as a way of interpreting both the political crisis triggered by Yoon's declaration of martial law, as well as plans for carrying out ideologically targeted assassinations and political violence. This type of operation of state power is based on the belief of political elites that their power is in a crisis, a moment of instability that requires radical measures to restore public order. Now, I also want you to think about this. So as long as Yoon was in office, let's look that up. Yoon's years in office, just for clarification, 2022 to 2025. Think about every piece of information that came out of South Korea about North Korea from 2022 to 2025, right? It came out of this guy's government. It came out of the government of the guy who said North Korea anti-state forces were conspiring to overthrow their country. It came out of the guy who had a political agenda to demonize the North, to provoke them to attack, to demonize them though. Why? To justify his own conservative right-wing political ambitions in South Korea. All right? That's the political apparatus that most of the West's understanding of North Korea came from the years 2022 to 2025. So how can you say you know about North Korea when you don't know about the South, when you don't understand what's going on here, right? Yoon, at that time, is in charge of the country, and what's going on here? State power based in the belief of political elites like Yoon that their power is in crisis and that North Korea is a threat to it somehow, or North Korea is a scapegoat for a threat he perceives. This mood evokes threatening enemies. In this case, Yoon's anti-state forces, but remember also North anti-state forces, as this author said earlier, that allegedly besieging safe spaces and simultaneously suggesting the necessity of purifying the population, since enemies are presumed to have either infiltrated society or indoctrinated some of us to side with them, end quote. Contemporary social theorist Giorgio Agamben argues that European states have increasingly resorted to invoking a crisis-ridden mood to justify the use of violence ever since Bonaparte France. However, such invocations of state of siege, along with brutal state violence, have been far more rampant in the context of colonialism and imperialism. This is because colonialism and imperialism are premised on violent domination over irreconcilable others, necessitating the state's active exclusion of these others from the realm of humanity, and thus from sovereign rights, and their extermination. Mbembe has theorized this form of sovereign power over life and death as necropower. I'll quote here from Mbembe. I put forward the notion of necropolitics, or necropower, to account for the various ways in which, in our contemporary world, weapons are deployed in the interest of maximally destroying persons and creating death worlds. That is, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to living conditions that confer upon them the status of the living dead. The imminent possibility of mass death, made starkly visible at the recent imposition of martial law, brought to the fore of the necropolitics at the core of the current government of South Korea. In fact, necropower has historically been the core of South Korean state power from its formation. One notable aspect of Mbembe's theory of necropower is that a state does not merely preserve the possibility of killing those it deems enemies, it actively pursues the mass production of death. In this sense, the distinction between the possibility of state violence and its actualization becomes meaningless. For a necropolitical state, violence that takes life is not a defensive measure vis-a-vis external threats, but a perpetuation of the foundational structure that contains its raison d'etre, in contrast to the biopolitical state envisioned by Foucault. Situating South Koreans within this mode of state power, they do not merely fear a state that preserves the possibility of mass killings. Mass death of political dissidents is a part of their living memory. The subsistence of South Korean subjects is conditioned on the deaths of those the state categorizes as, quote, communist terrorists, who are deemed associates of North Korea. So again, think about this. You're like, I'm an expert in North Korea. All the information I'm telling you to consume comes from sources affiliated with the United States government in South Korea. I don't know anything about South Korea. Then you don't know anything about North Korea. All of the subsistence of South Korean subjects is conditioned on the deaths of those the state categorizes as communist terrorists associated with North Korea. You don't think that might influence your understanding of the information you're hearing about North Korea from these people? This is the perpetual state of fear they are meant to live in. They remember that if they step out of line, if they say anything too nice about the North, what happens? Your fingernail gets permanently damaged because Secret Service agents show up at your door and torture you for days and tell you to stop saying it. Your family gets slaughtered. You get dropped off of a high peak into the ocean. You get disappeared into a prison system where nobody ever hears from you again. This is a recent living memory for these people, right? So this is the state that the average person in South Korea exists in at all times. Understanding the threat of being deemed a communist terrorist associated with North Korea. As Hyuna Kwan has poignantly observed, the family's histories of many South Koreans are fraught with taboos and secrets, closely entangled with past state violence inflicted on those categorized as irreconcilable others. Another significant aspect, therefore, is the social life of those subsisting within that what Mbembe calls a death world, whom he calls the living dead. One facet of being living dead is being a survivor subjected to state power that is involved in maximally destroying. From the foundation of South Korea in 1948 to the present, many citizens have been subjected to state violence solely because they had family members, close friends, or romantic partners who were murdered by the state. Right? So remember that. Every accusation is a confession. We know until 1980, guilty by association. That was legal. Now they're probably still doing it, if I had to guess. It's just not legal. It's just not above board. This guilt by association, Yongwon-jae, targets its subjects maximally rather than confining state violence to only the most necessary occasions. Under these conditions, when mass death is common in a society, the state produces thoroughly disciplined, apolitical, and docile subjects. For these individuals, political involvement becomes a fearful experience, as speaking back to the powerful requires them to risk their lives. Furthermore, another aspect of being living dead is that those subjected to necropower are not entirely insulated from political participation. Rather, they become involved in perpetuating state violence as a means to survive and even thrive. In a necropolitical state, subjects are often swayed and mobilized as instruments of legitimization by the powerful, with varying degrees of active consent. Think about that. Listen to South Korean voices. Why don't people in South Korea tell me this? Why aren't the Korean people telling me this? I don't know, because their grandmothers were fucking tortured to death? Because their grandparents had a spear ripped through their stomach? With a child pulled out the other end of it? Because their families experienced mass rape as their villages were burned on suspicion of saying things like what I'm telling you right now? Right? So, in that way, the people of South Korea who cannot speak back, the older people who remember this, right? Maybe the younger people whose families told them in whispered hushed voices about that past, they then become instruments of legitimization for that new government. They have varying degrees of active consent. Some of them might be like, yeah, sure, I grew up propagandized. I don't know. Some of them might be like, I know the truth, but I can't say anything. Right? I can't say anything because maybe my family who are still South Korean are there. Maybe they'd get in trouble. Maybe the Secret Service would show up at their door. I don't know. Maybe I'm still a South Korean citizen. Maybe I still have a South Korean passport, right? And I'm legally prohibited from saying it even if I'm not in the South Korean borders, right? Even if I'm in the United States borders. These are all things that affect this. And in that way, that's how the subjects of that state, South Korea, are swayed and mobilized to legitimize the state as it exists today as a puppet, vassal, neocolonial state under military occupation by the U.S. Right? A necropolitical state does not merely make its subjects live and let die. It allows its subjects to subsist so they may participate in this mass violence. In the context of South Korea today, the living dead describes the right-wing activists and masses who staunchly support Yoon, despite the fiasco that followed his martial law declaration and his ultimate impeachment. Just like the notorious Northwest Youth League in the past, these right-wing groups embody the necro power emanating from a South Korean state. A conspicuous image for foreign observers is right-wing protesters holding the South Korean flag in one hand and the U.S. flag in the other. Right? So zoom in on this image. What's it say? CCP out. They're holding the American flag. They're holding the Korean flag, South Korean flag. Right? Think about everything we know. Do you think that these are people operating freely with political agency in support of the United States government after what the United States government did to them? Probably not most of them. Probably most of them, this is the only world they know. This is how they know to survive this world that got created, right? Autistic Batty 3 says, my Jordanian Palestinian husband still fears speaking out about the Jordanian king in case we were able to visit family we have there. Yeah. Siesta says, my mother says she left Korea because people around her were disappeared. Yep. Necropolitics, Complaining Laney says, depends on as much on who they let live, who gets to live, and who they kill. Exactly. All right, so let's go back. Oh no, clicking the link made me lose our place. That's okay, we'll find it again. Such scenes starkly bespeak South Korea's continuous entanglement with U.S. imperialism. South Korean state's active pursuit of death-making and its mass disciplining of subjects as the living dead are, in fact, undergirded by the historical structure of U.S. imperialism and South Korean sub-imperialism. Above all, during the immediate post-colonial moment of the Korean Peninsula, when U.S. imperialism first became entrenched in South Korea, necropower gradually yet thoroughly penetrated the social lives of those residing in the southern half of the peninsula. Now, if you didn't listen to our first two streams on this might be, you might have a little less context for this, but for those of you who did, you know exactly what is being talked about here, right? In all, the four elements of necropower are, number one, the invoking of the presence of an enemy both inside and outside of a state. Number two, the maximal production of mass deaths. Number three, disciplining the population into becoming the living dead. And number four, becoming entangled with colonialism and imperialism. In this section, I trace its historical emergence in South Korea, beginning with the foundational violence of the late 1940s, particularly what I called the Jeju Genocide from 1947 to 1954. The institutionalization of necropolitical logic is evident in archival records about Jeju that document not just the scale of violence beginning it, but its systematic character. This reveals how mass violence was not hidden, but celebrated as a patriotic achievement. On August 15, 1949, on the first anniversary of the establishment of the Republic of Korea, the country's first president, Syngman Rhee, marked the occasion. When the government of the Republic of Korea was inaugurated, Jeju Island, with its 300,000 population, was largely in the hands of the brutal communist terrorists. Now remember, think about what's going on at the time. August 15th, 1949. Syngman Rhee, not particularly popular. People do not like him. He's a puppet of the United States. The people of South Korea don't know it. Most of the people of Korea are communists, right? They are actively taking up arms and trying to expel the Americans. They're fighting against the police. They're attacking police stations under Syngman Rhee's command. So think about what he's getting up and saying. He's not reflecting the reality of how people around him are thinking, right? He is willing this thought process into being. And I think that is so interesting with the speech. He says, when the government of the Republic of Korea was inaugurated, Jeju Island, with its 300,000 population, was largely in the hands of the brutal communist terrorists. Most of the people he's speaking to are communists. Think about that. They're communists. They're there. They're communists. Most of Korea is communist at this time, as we learned in our previous streams when we went through these documents. So imagine hearing that. You're a communist. Everybody you know is a communist. This would be like somebody coming to your org and saying, well, you know, thank God that we fought off all of those disgusting, vile communists, like standing in front of you. And you're looking at everybody you know going, what the fuck? Right? So I really want you to understand that that's the context for what's going on. Bye, Mamish. The election of May 10th, 1948 could be held in only one of the island's 3 districts. Why? Because they were communists. They boycotted the election. By last spring, however, the communist forces had been eliminated. Think about what you know about how the communist forces were eliminated. People's grandparents were raped and killed. And the election was held peacefully on May 10th, 1949. The rebellion instigated by these communist elements in the army at Yosu and Suncheon last October was promptly put down. These are indigenous people fighting the American occupation of their land. Syngman Rhee, flown in on a U.S. military plane from the United States, where he had been working previously with the OSS, which would later become the CIA, with his Princeton degree and his Austrian wife, brought in on a U.S. military airplane to South Korea, propped in front of these people and told, this is your president, now bow. Right? This is the election of which they speak. With the United States, the chief of our liberators from Japan, and the nation that carried to the UN a fight for the restoration of Korea's unity and independence. This is the country that actually divided them and refused to let them unify. Our relations have been particularly cordial and beneficial. This is remember the stories we just heard even. All those people, what were they protesting? The U.S. military government in Korea. Right? It is shameful, yes. Hi, first-time chat also. American military cooperation in our defense program and the economic support granted through the ECA are the principal factors enabling us to reestablish ourselves as a free nation. Does this sound like a free nation to you? And to make the fullest possible contribution of our own in the global struggle to safeguard democratic freedom against the aggressive drive of totalitarian communism. They're experiencing totalitarian capitalism as we speak. They're getting slaughtered, quite literally, by totalitarian capitalism. And what does Syngman Rhee say? Well, they're in the global struggle to safeguard democratic freedom against totalitarian communism. The great victory won by American arms in the Pacific is in peril. We of Asia ponder the course of Western diplomacy. It's like, you have not even been in Asia for 40 years, Syngman Rhee. What are you talking about? You just showed up a couple months ago. You've lived 40 years of your life in the United States. The fires of communism, which may have been allayed in Europe, rage unhindered in the Far East. Korea may seem the end of the line, correspondingly unimportant in what to the Western world has been a Cold War, but to us Koreans, we are on the front line in battle formation. The fight we may be called upon to fight is the fight of all decent men everywhere. We are helping the cause of global freedom at the risk of our lives. We are not ashamed to call upon the rest of the world for aid. Now, keep in mind, this guy's in his 70s at this point. Okay? He's not going to go fight. He's not putting his body on the line to die for Western capital. So what's he doing here? He is attempting to manipulate the people of Korea into putting their bodies on the line to fight and die in defense of Western capital. If the democracies are left to face the whole weight of the communist attack, one by one, they will eventually fall. His country is full of communists. Everybody in his country is a communist right now. It is only standing together. There's a few people who joined the Hitler Youth group. So there's like 2,000 Hitler Youth, and everybody else in Korea is a communist. These are the people he's speaking to. If the democracies are left to face the whole weight of the communist attack, one by one, they will fall. It is only standing together that the safety of all can be assured. Safety, as they're massacring these people. To quote Benjamin Franklin, who said in 1777, remember this is a Korean, supposedly the leader of Korea, fighting for Korea, an independent Korea. He's quoting Benjamin Franklin, right? Our cause is the cause of all mankind, and we are fighting for their liberty and defending our own. We shall fight alone if necessary. So this is one of the most deranged speeches to me, right? This is for America. Syngman Rhee is signaling to the Americans that he is semi-reliable and loyal lapdog. He's kind of not. He's actually more gung-ho than some of the other Americans. He is a specific type of American allegiance, and that is with the McCarthy-era Republicans in Congress. That's who his people are in the United States back home. Yeah, famously Korean, Benjamin Franklin. Now, to contrast this, which we do a lot in the podcast you get a timeline comparison of what's happening in the North versus the South at the same time. And it's really stark comparison, what's going on. In the North, they have a 30-some-odd-year-old war hero from fighting for Korean freedom in charge of their country. They implemented Benjamin Franklin loving Mr. USA to be in charge of the South. So, the author says, Rhee's statement is drenched in the blood of those putatively categorized as communist terrorists, communist elements, communist forces. It's 12:04. We're going to go a little bit late today, though, because I do really like this article. The enemy inside, to the extent that he was sanguine about the future of South Korea precisely because of the bloodbath. During this period from March 1947 to May of 1950, at least 100,000 Koreans were killed by state violence. And the anti-communist mass killings that followed the outbreak of the Korean War claimed another 100,000 lives. In reality, Jeju was controlled by the South Korean government, not by brutal communist terrorists, and its natives were murdered by South Korean forces. This genocidal violence was integral to the process through which the Rhee administration, along with his right-wing entourage, sought to prove the worth of South Korean peoplehood within an American-led world order. Indeed, Lee boasted about South Korea's cordial relationship with the U.S., which in his worldview was the chief of our liberators. The self-imposed entanglement with U.S. imperialism is reflected in his proclamation that the South Korean people would join the fight of all decent men everywhere, that is, the global struggle against communism. Eventually, Ri discursively enmeshed all South Koreans in a global war serving U.S. geopolitical interests. Yeah, we Korean people will die for you, USA. Welcome, Mr. Smarks. During the immediate post-colonial period, many of those who defied this imperial entanglement were mass murdered. Put differently, Ri's subjection of South Korea to U.S. imperialism was made possible through the mass killings of his political opponents. A decisive prerequisite in this context was the categorical determination of whom would be regarded as the communist terrorists Ri referenced in the speech. I just realized I have to text my coworker really fast, actually. Oh, sorry, I just pulled up all my text for you guys. Let me do this really fast since I'm running late. Hold on. Done. Sorry. All right. Here we go. Back in. Since I'm running late, I gotta do the text. Okay. In fact, many South Koreans vivaciously resisted becoming South Koreans. The looming division of the post-colonial Korean peninsula and the gradual entrenchment of U.S. imperialism. As early as September and October of 1946, large-scale protests erupted in Daegu against continued colonialism since the U.S. occupation government reinstated many local bureaucrats and police officers who had collaborated with Japanese colonizers. Moreover, in February of 1947, students in Jeju opposed the distribution of U.S. food imports, which were offered as a stopgap measure to address the failures of U.S. occupation policies in managing agricultural goods. The participants in these protests were not mass murdered at the time, but key organizers were blacklisted and later killed by the state after the genocidal mode of governance was established following the Jeju genocide. During this period, left-wing and center-left political blocs garnered significantly more popular support than did right-wing supporters of Syngman Rhee. Indeed, immediately after Japan's surrender to the U.S. on August 15, 1945, Korean anti-colonial movement forces quickly mobilized and established people's committees. These committees became governing bodies immediately after Japan's surrender, proliferating to 2,244 branches across the Korean peninsula. These people's committees proclaimed the Korean People's Republic on September 6, 1945, a day before U.S. entry, though this attempt was immediately dissuaded by the U.S. occupation. Yet in August 1946, U.S.-administered survey found that 70% of respondents favored a social democratic state, while only 14% supported a U.S.-led capitalist system, and just 7% advocated for a Soviet-style communist state. So this is the Americans asking this in August of 1946. Now, I think it is important to remember, though, that these people were communists. There's a huge communist presence going on. So when they say advocating for a Soviet-style communist state, that also has some political implication at the time, because the Americans are basically being like, do you want the USSR to take over your country? That's really how they're wording this in this thing. So that's kind of like a leading question, but that's, not actually what would be the answer. What they want is to be in charge of their own country, right? Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead some. So this is worded a little wacky here, right? Okay. So despite clear popular support for left-wing and center-left blocs, I am going to say the takeaway you can have here is that they wanted the People's Committees, is what you take away from that. They wanted the People's Committees. And the People's Committees were led by a lot of communists, and they were actually working together with the left-wing nationalists of Korea to form a government and take over these tasks. That's what people were in favor for. Despite clear popular support for the left-wing and center-left blocs, U.S. occupation officials chose to partner with Rhee and his right-wing allies to govern the southern half of the Korean peninsula. This inclination for indirect rule was largely motivated by inter-imperial competition against the Soviet Union and by the right-wingers' willingness to adhere to U.S. imperialism. As mentioned earlier, the U.S. appointed many former collaborators with Japan to top bureaucratic positions in the occupation government. Pyeongkok Cho became chief of the Korean National Police, while other key roles such as Supreme Court justices, chief prosecutor, directors of the Departments of Agriculture, Education, and more were filled by right-wing politicians. Remember, there's hardly any right-wingers there. Most people just wanted their government. Also worth noting, though, similarly, this was a way of figuring out if people were favorable to the U.S. or the USSR. And the Korean people did not care about the U.S. or the USSR. They just wanted to do their own thing. So really, that's, I think, the biggest takeaway from here. But they were also separate from this poll, just not very right-wing. They didn't, and we know this because they didn't have a lot of right-wing politicians for the USA to even try to pull from. Of course, yes. I'm glad you guys are appreciating this. Unsurprisingly, roughly 80% of police officers had previously served under the Japanese regime. So the police officers were former Japan collaborators. So also think about this. When the U.S. is asking this question, what they're saying is, do you want to be affiliated with the United States? Do you want to be affiliated with the USSR? Or do you want to do your own thing? That's really what the question being asked here. Do you favor a social democratic state? But that's not affiliated with anybody. So in the USA, it's like, do you want a US-led capitalist system or a USSR-led communist system? The answer they were actually giving is they do not want any other country to be in charge of them. Right? And to their credit, the USSR did not want to be in charge of them either. The USSR was like, be independent. We don't have time for this. We don't want to deal with this. The United States is who wanted to be in charge of them. So think about that too with this survey poll, right? So when they say that the police had collaborated with Japan, that also ties into this. They did not like people who collaborated with Japan, and they did not want anybody else collaborating with any other country there either. They wanted to be independent. And that is what the USSR had repeatedly tried to stress to the Americans. They are going to want to be independent. They're going to want to be independent. They don't want either of us there. They want to be independent. And to get more into that, you can listen to the podcast about this period. So this inclination for indirect rule was largely motivated by inter-imperial competition against the Soviet Union and by the right-wingers' willingness to adhere to U.S. imperialism. As mentioned earlier, the U.S. appointed many former collaborators with Japan to top bureaucratic positions. Unsurprisingly, 80% of police officers had also served with the Japanese regime. In the context of bifurcation between an anti-colonial and left-leaning public and a pro-empire right-wing dominated regime, the right-wingers seized the opportunity to unleash mass violence against the people of Jeju, who had long been regarded as lesser than mainland Koreans. So think about this. The public is anti-colonial and left-leaning, right? That's why they are like, well, we don't want to do Soviet-style communism or U.S.-style capitalism. We want to do our own thing. It's more that they're anti-colonial. They don't want to be subjugated to the will of the United States or the USSR. The USSR acknowledges this and is like, bet, we frankly just won a war but lost a bunch of people and our land got fucked up. We don't want to have to be responsible for you too. And the United States is the only people who want to continue that colonial legacy there. So the right-wingers seeing this opportunity to unleash mass violence against the people of Jeju, who had long been regarded as lesser than the mainland Koreans. So this is also why it's classified as a genocide, because they are a different kind of group than mainland Koreans. But also, they have a very small amount of people supporting politically this U.S.-backed right-wing regime. Embedded within the broader context of mass protests against the policies and presence of the U.S. military government and its appointment of right-wing Koreans to key administrative positions, Jeju people gathered in Jeju City to demonstrate on March 1st. So we remember this. We remember the little boys kicked in the face, the police opened fire on the crowd as they protested, people died. We remember this whole section, right? This is a map of Jeju Island also. Remember they talked about the volcano basically in the center? That's what's going on here, right? So, during the same month, members of the Northwest Youth League arrived on Jeju, right? That's like the Hitler Youth group there. Now, against this backdrop, Pyonggak-cho, chief of the KMP, flew to Jeju on March 14th, 1947 and made the following public statement. I, the chief of Korean National Police, have come to Jeju with deep concern. Reported that many administrative branches were paralyzed upon an unfortunate incident on March 1st. I have come with an infallible measure to protect your compatriots' lives and properties. Also, the fundamental plan to eradicate the elements rendering Jeju fallen into the deceitful propaganda and destructive disorder has been prepared. There is nothing other than rioting that jeopardizes the prospect of the nation building. What kind of nation are they trying to build? A right-wing U.S.-led capitalist nation against the will of the people. Frequent riots only expose our nation's lacking credibility for political and moral autonomy to the eyes and ears of the international community. So what's the police chief saying? Well, when you riot, you make it look like we can't be in charge of ourselves. Just be like really good and listen to the Americans, and then like maybe they'll know we can manage ourselves. That's literally what he's saying. This makes no sense. This statement shows the incipient stage of necropower. Cho assumes that the mass killing of those the regime labeled communists or left-wingers was necessary to protect us from them. Furthermore, he claimed that Koreans needed to prove their civility to the international community, which was clearly led by the U.S. Empire State. He urged Jeju people to be docile and disciplined, even though he and other state forces from the peninsula would mass murder fellow Jeju folks categorized as the irreconcilable others. The 4 elements of necropower were already in place during this early stage of the Jeju Genocide in March of 1947. These elements became decisively structured through mass participation from top-level officials to civilians through violence, first in Jeju and later across the southern portion of the Korean peninsula. In other words, while the Jeju events established the template for necropolitical governance, subsequent episodes demonstrated how this model could be scaled and systematized. Following the aforementioned developments of March 1947, Jeju natives continued to resist, and the U.S.-backed regime responded with torture, mass incarceration, and other forms of violence. On April 3, 1948, approximately 500 lightly armed insurgents rose up against the ongoing state violence, which provided a pretext for the southern regime to drastically escalate state violence back. Now, when we say lightly armed, they had spears they carved from bamboo. I mean, this really was, when you think about an indigenous people's uprising against a massive occupying military power, that's what it was. They literally were making their own weapons to rise up against people armed by the U.S. military. Okay? Archival materials from this period vividly attest to the mass killings of civilians. Hold on, drink a little coffee. Government officials and military officers reported that thousands of raiders were put to death, while only a few rifles were seized, and relatively few government soldiers were killed in battle. Remember, 80% of the violence going one way. During this operation, I just want to say, I think about this image sometimes. It's like the two sides of the Palestine conflict for reference. And it's a little kid with a rock, right? Or a little kid on a bicycle versus a giant Israeli tank. Similar is how I visualize this. You're picturing local villagers with spears they carved out of bamboo up against the U.S. military occupying their land. During this operation, soldiers tied the taeguki, which would later become South Korea's national flag, to their rifles during the counterinsurgency. This implies they understood their actions were a patriotic act contributing to the nation building. Despite these acts of state violence, resistance to U.S. imperialism and the U.S.-backed regime did not completely subside. In October of 1948, the government's 14th Regiment rose in protest against orders to assist in the genocidal operations against the Jeju people. So the military was like, we're not doing it. We're not doing this. For the newly founded South Korean state, this served as an opportunity to further impose anti-communist ideology. During counterinsurgency operations, soldiers who committed so-called meritorious deeds, such as killing alleged communists, were awarded medals, effectively sanctioning these killings as acts of patriotism. During and after suppressing this rebellion, top-level officials expanded institutionalized surveillance to help ideologically control the new South Korean population. Beginning in November 1948, the state sponsored the organization of various right-wing associations to serve as surveillance agents, using a strategy modeled after measures first experimented in Jeju. In April of 1948, the Civilian Vigilantes was established on Jeju Island. Every man between the ages of 15 and 65 had to join under threat of death, and all non-combatants were required to make donations to support the vigilantes' upkeep. In November, mainland South Korean households were coerced to contribute to right-wing associations. So they're forcing people to be right-wing against their will, basically, right? The National Guidance League illustrates a crucial element of necropower, the maximal destruction of lives. It took charge of converting people devoted to socialist ideology and communist ideals into South Korean patriots committed to anti-communism. Anyone who participated in protests against the regime or was suspected of harboring communist beliefs was forcibly enlisted. So what do they tell us about the North? They tell us, oh, they're brainwashed. They have re-education camps. What are they doing in the South? They are forcefully brainwashing and sending to re-education camps communists. Right? When a Korean War broke out in 1950, National Guidance League members were prioritized for elimination by the state. The exact number of victims remains undetermined, with estimates ranging from 100,000 to 300,000. The genocidal state violence was not a surgical operation to prepare for war, but an act of maximal killing, including against those undergoing conversion to become patriots. So remember this. National Guidance League was going to convert people who had been communists and socialists into capitalism, U.S. living patriots. And what happens when the Korean War starts? They're like, kill them first. Kill all those people in that program first. Fuck them, right? These operations to manufacture a compliant population of living dead should be understood within the broader context of top-level officials' staunch commitment to integrating the new South Korean state into the global reach of the U.S. Empire State. Pyongyangcho's speech on May 16, 1949, which he delivered while serving as South Korea's envoy to the UN, illustrates this. To ensure the stability of the government is the most urgent problem. The communistic forces have been, are, and will be carrying on activities to overthrow the government. Even under American military government, hundreds and thousands of good citizens were killed by communist terrorists. In the period from February 1948 to February 1949 in Jeju Island alone, 12,000 people were murdered. 15,000 houses or buildings were burned. Remember again, we found out that they were dressing up, the Hitler-style youth groups in South Korea were dressing up like the communists and doing this to try to blame it on them. Remember that. 12,000 people were murdered, right? We don't have any evidence of that. 15,000 houses were burned. Yeah, they were burned by right-wingers. The Russians and the Northern regime have entered into a political alliance, North Korea being assured of military and economic aid. The U.S. forced that to happen. Russia didn't even want to be involved in that. Further, the North Korea regime and the expanding Chinese communists have a military alliance. 3 divisions of the North Korea army are fighting in China now, and that's true, they were fighting against in the Civil War. And aggression from the North into the South is expected at any time. In the face of these dangers, I believe the American people will realize how critical and important South Korea's problems of national defense are. Present armed strength is far less than that of the North. All of our armed services have to be strengthened. My government also expects from the United States a definite assurance of military support in case of aggression by foreign forces or by foreign-supported domestic elements. Cho delivered the speech before the full-scale invasion of the anti-communist genocide, and his concerns for regime security are fathomable. However, he categorized any political opponents of South Korea's regime and U.S. imperialism as foreign forces, irreconcilable others, enemies to be killed. Moreover, it was South Korean troops that had mass murdered good citizens, not communist terrorists. This falsehood, as well as his invocation of a threatening enemy, China, North Korea, the Soviet Union, served as justificatory rhetoric for the mass production of death. The Truman administration's promise of military and economic aid also served as justification for mass killings those deemed to be enemy within. Truman proposed to U.S. Congress to provide $150 million in aid to South Korea. Securing congressional approval required barring the Rhee government from forming a coalition with any communist faction. Rhee and other top officials interpreted this condition as a mandate to completely eradicate communist terrorists from South Korean territory. We only have 8 minutes left of my lunch break that I'm cutting into, so we're going to jump ahead just a little bit. We're like halfway through this. I do recommend you read the rest of this document on your own. It is in our DPRK document that's pinned to the top of the chat. But as demonstrated in the case of the Jeju Genocide discussed in the previous section, necropower became entrenched as a fundamental component of South Korean socio-political life, specifically through the initiatives of right-wing elites and later the participation of everyday South Koreans with varying degree of volition. This participation was a form of agency that is constitutive, not transformative, of a historical structure fraught with necropower. In other words, South Korean soldiers' involvement in mass murdering putative communist terrorists in Jeju, state-sanctioned execution of National Guidance League members, top-level officials' discursive categorization of irreconcilable others, and their directives to murder whomever they deemed communist terrorists, along with their self-imposed subjugation to U.S. imperialism, were all constitutive agencies of a structure sustained by necropower as its core component. I call this structure in question South Korean sub-imperialism. Zay's here. Thus, necropower and sub-imperialism are not separate phenomena, but co-constitutive processes that emerge simultaneously during South Korea's foundational period. Sub-imperialism challenges the prevalent understanding found in dependency theory. So we're going to cut through this a little bit and get more towards the end. South Korean sub-imperialism structures the identity formation of the South. South Korean people, South, had become a historical subject precisely by encountering and participating in the mass death of those categorized as non-South Koreans. As Mbembe notes, becoming a subject therefore supposes upholding the work of death, and following Hegel's insight, the life of spirit is not the life that is frightened of death and spares itself destruction, but the life that assumes death and lives with death. South Korean sub-imperial identity was forged through this acceptance of death, both the death of others and the potential for one's own death if categorized as an enemy of the sub-imperial order. Hegel mentioned! The process of necropolitical subject formation creates what Mbembe calls the living dead, subjects who embody necropower while remaining under imperial domination. So, globally, South Korean sub-imperialism reflects the making of South Korean people South Korean peoplehood embedded in the broader structure of U.S. imperialism. South Korean sub-imperialism is conditioned by U.S. imperialism, and the South Korean state's global strategies are contingent on U.S. strategies. Right-wing politician statements, such as those I referenced above, clearly demonstrate they view U.S. imperial influence as a scope within which they aspire to subject themselves. Their necropolitics and staunch commitment to anti-communist ideology would have been insignificant had it not been for U.S. imperial influence on Southern Korea. So there's some talk here about the Vietnam War as well, which is interesting and relevant, but we're going to skip because we have 5 minutes. Hegel's big dialectical, single-handedly making people excited to hear Hegel mentioned. Literally unheard of in history. Well, Hegel has boobs here, so, you know. I think he's pretty. I think people like the boob, right? He's so cute. So, necropolitical living. We're going to talk for a few more minutes about the living dead as sub-imperial subjects whose identities depend on the continued operation of necropower. The presence of the living dead connects the past to the present, linking the structuring historical event of the Jeju Genocide to the structured reality of the 2024 Martial Law Declaration. The manifestation of necropower in the form of physical violence broadly defined, as well as the imminent possibility of its enactment, coexist within the structure of the South Korean sub-imperialism. Right? What does it mean to be of the living dead in South Korea when you remember the stories of what's been done to people who dared to speak up? Right? This is how the ghosts of the past and the people living today, the living dead, are connected. Zay sighting. Hi, what's up? Yeah, come on in there. Get in there. There you go. Good, Sissy. She's so cute. So from the 1940s to the present day, political dissidents have been persecuted, tortured, and at times killed for refusing to subsist as members of the disciplined and docile living dead. Political dissidents have been framed as pro-North Korea spies, a pattern that persists today, with 3 cases prosecuted during Suk Yeol-yoon's presidency, even during large-scale protests in 2016 and 2017 calling for the impeachment of then-President Yoon Hye-park. South Korean military officials considered deploying 4,800 armed soldiers, 4,800 armed soldiers, 550 armored vehicles, 200 tanks, and 1,400 special warfare command troops to crush demonstrations, according to the South Korean civic group Military Human Rights Center for Korea. Throughout South Korean history from 1948 until the present, working-class struggles for civil rights, shorter working hours, and improved wages have been red-baited with anti-communist ideology. A well-known case is that of renowned labor movement leader Jin Suk-kim, who in 1986 was tortured in the anti-communism division room in Seoul after protesting her dismissal for union activities at Hanjin Heavy Industry in Busan. More recently, laid-off workers at Sangyong Motors faced severe isolation following a local police raid on their lock-in strike site. From 2009 to 2018, 30 union-affiliated workers committed suicide. Now, something we haven't really talked about much here, I don't think, is that suicide is used as has a history of mass protest in South Korea. We know South Korea has a high suicide rates out of all the OECD countries, right? Famously. I don't know if we met our sub goal. Maybe we did. I don't know. But yeah, it's used as a tool of mass protest. It's political. Suicide in South Korea has political connotations, which we don't often discuss, right? Stigmatized for their supposed communist activities, they were unable to find jobs and struggled to make a living. In addition to these attacks on labor, South Korean women have had to resist being relegated to second-class citizenship. Seung Suk Moon aptly attributes South Korea's long-standing patriarchy to its patriarchy. Historically constructed through state-led engineering of a gender regime. She focuses on how the Chung-hee Park regime shaped gender divisions in industry and the military, which I argue stemmed from the structure of South Korean sub-imperialism developed since the 1940s. One notable fact, as Song Kim has documented, is that sexual violence was systematically deployed during the Jeju Genocide. Perpetrators targeted women specifically because of their central roles in maintaining family lineages and community bonds, effectively weaponizing gender-based violence to dismantle the foundations of Jeju's social life. Yoon Shil Kim's analysis of what she terms holy among bodies explores the lived experiences of bereaved women who lost family members during the Jeju genocide, revealing how this violence created embodied sites where trauma was both inscribed and transformed into forms of resistance. The patterns of gendered violence established during the Jeju genocide later turned into sub-imperial boomerang towards Koreans on the mainland as the extreme sexual objectification of Korean women, including their trafficking as sex workers for South Korean and U.S. troops during the First Korean War, then the Vietnam War, and ensuing decades. In the present day, feminist groups in South Korea have protested an epidemic of violence against women, including murder and intimate partner violence. A prominent femicide case in 2016 accelerated a movement among South Korean women to speak about their own experiences as an act of mourning. These efforts have exposed how the phenomenon of mass death facing South Korean women, which remains an inherent possibility within their social lives, can be clearly traced through the country's militarized culture to the state's foundational necropolitics. I think it's interesting. We obviously know about the 4B movement, and it is a reactionary movement, right? It's a reactionary feminist movement against violence against women there. But there's a political and historical root for it, right, that can be addressed and discussed. Which is, there's been a massive history of violence against women. Women there are extremely oppressed, and that might not be the right reaction to come out of it. That's the reactionary reaction to come out of it, right? But you understand it's a response to a very real problem, at least, right? Okay, it's 12:31. I'm going to have to jump off. I gave you my lunch break, chat, but now I must work. So this wraps up our section on the Jeju genocide, which was horrific, right? When we talk about the genocide committed in South Korea, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about the Korean War. We're talking about Jeju Island. And it's very horrifying what was done. I think we did a good job of not being too gratuitous and graphic with the details, but if you want to know more, the details are horrific. You can find them by looking more into these. I do again recommend reading through the Korean Labor Party CIA document that shows the extent of the communist presence in the South, as well as The Island of World Peace, The Jeju Massacre and State Building in South Korea, the book by Guisuk Kwan. And remember, when we talk about communists, we're so propagandized, we think of communists as being an enemy element. But communists were just the people of Korea. The people of Korea were just communists. And so this is something interesting to keep in mind. Okay. Is there somebody who we're raiding? I'm going to look at TankTube for a raid rack. Just me. It's just me, chat. Who are we going to raid? Who should we raid? Anybody? Yes, of course. Please do check them out more. Please read Guisuk Kwan's book. Remember, she's in South Korea. So limited. Non-political rec from Smash. Okay, hit us with it. We'll send it to anybody. If anybody has a political rec, feel free to send it as well. What's the username? I don't know who that is. My charger fell out of my light. Animal education. Okay. All right. What's the username for it? We'll do it. Animal communist. Is it just Maya? Is that just the username? Maya? Just like that? It's an OP username? Oh, wow. Okay. Let's do it. Why did I forget how to do a raid? Is it like that? Yes. Yes. Let's do it. All right, chat. Go forth and learn about animals, and I will see you tomorrow with a current events segment. Thank you all for hanging out.